Hello, and welcome to Midnight Cat. I am the Midnight Cat, and tonight I will guide you toward a quiet island resting beneath the ancient Mediterranean sky. Together, we will leave the modern world behind and travel slowly into the distant Bronze Age, where the remains of Europe's earliest great civilization waited silently beneath layers of earth. The story does not begin in Athens. It does not begin in Rome. Instead, it begins on the island of Crete, a long and rugged land shaped by mountains, deep valleys, fertile plains, and rocky shores surrounded by the clear blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea. In ancient times, Crete stood at an important meeting point between different worlds. To the south lay Egypt. Farther east were the wealthy kingdoms and trading cities of the Near East. To the north and west stretched the coastlines of Europe. Ships moving between these regions often passed close to Crete, bringing with them goods, ideas, artistic styles, and stories from distant places. Here, during the Bronze Age, an extraordinary culture began to grow. Its people built large and beautiful palace complexes. They decorated their walls with graceful paintings filled with color and movement. Their art showed flowers, animals, sea creatures, festivals, and people dressed in elegant clothing. The world they created appears surprisingly bright. Their frescoes suggest a society that admired nature, movement, craftsmanship, and ceremony. Dolphins swam across painted walls. Young figures carried offerings through palace corridors. Men and women appeared in flowing clothing, surrounded by patterns inspired by the sea and the land. Yet the civilization that produced these things eventually disappeared. Its palaces were abandoned or destroyed. Its writing was forgotten. Its language became silent. Even the true identity of its people faded from human memory. For many centuries, almost nothing remained except scattered ruins, buried objects, and one dark and mysterious legend. The legend of the Minotaur. Tonight, we will follow the rediscovery of this forgotten civilization. We will walk beside the archaeologists who uncovered its great palaces and opened rooms that had remained hidden for thousands of years. We will look upon vivid frescoes, strange symbols, mysterious goddesses, and clay tablets written in a language that has still not been fully understood. We will also travel across the sea to the volcanic island now known as Santorini, where one of the most powerful eruptions in ancient history may have changed the world of the people of Crete forever. Before we begin our journey, you may take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It is a simple way to support Midnight Cat and help these peaceful journeys through history continue. You can also leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there tonight. It is always comforting to imagine listeners in many different places, all gathering beneath the same quiet night sky. And now, settle into a comfortable position. Let your breathing become slower. Allow the sounds of the present to fade gently into the distance. We are going back more than 3,000 years toward the lost world of the Minoans. Before history is written down, it often survives through stories. Memories pass from one generation to another. Facts become mixed with imagination. Real kings become legendary rulers. Forgotten buildings become impossible mazes, and old disasters become punishments sent by the gods. For the island of Crete, whose true past remained hidden for so long, memory survived in the form of a dark and powerful myth. It was a story told beside warm hearths in Athens. It may have been repeated during long evenings in royal halls, while oil lamps flickered against painted walls and listeners gathered close. It was a tale of pride, punishment, sacrifice, and courage. The legend began with King Minos, the powerful ruler of Crete. According to the old story, Minos ruled a great island kingdom from his palace at Knossos. He wished to prove that the gods supported his right to become king, and so he prayed to Poseidon, the god of the sea. Minos asked Poseidon to send him a sign. The god answered. From the foaming water of the Mediterranean emerged a magnificent white bull. Its coat was said to be perfectly pure, shining brightly in the sunlight as it stepped from the sea. The appearance of this animal was taken as proof that Poseidon favored Minos. In return, the king was expected to sacrifice the bull in honor of the god. But Minos hesitated. The animal was so rare and so beautiful that he decided to keep it among his own herds. Instead of sacrificing the sacred bull, he offered another animal in its place, hoping that Poseidon would not notice the deception. But in the world of Greek mythology, the gods were rarely fooled. Poseidon saw what Minos had done, and the king's broken promise could not remain unpunished. The sea god chose a strange and terrible form of revenge. He did not destroy the palace. He did not send a storm against Crete. Instead, he placed a curse upon Minos's wife, Queen Pasiphae. Under the influence of the god, the queen became consumed by an unnatural desire for the sacred white bull. Unable to free herself from the curse, Pasiphae turned to a man named Daedalus. Daedalus was believed to be the most brilliant inventor and craftsman of his age. He had come to Crete after leaving Athens and had found safety in the court of King Minos. The queen ordered Daedalus to construct a hollow wooden cow. The structure was made to appear lifelike. It was covered with the hide of a real animal, and there was enough space inside for the queen to conceal herself. From this strange and cursed union came a monstrous child. The creature had the body of a powerful man, but the head and tail of a bull. He was given the name Asterion. In later stories, however, he became known by another name, the Minotaur. The name meant the bull of Minos. King Minos was horrified by the creature. The Minotaur was not only dangerous, but also a living reminder of the king's disobedience and the punishment that had followed. Once again, Minos turned to Daedalus. He commanded the inventor to design a prison from which the creature could never escape. Daedalus accepted the task and created the labyrinth. It was said to be an enormous maze filled with twisting corridors, hidden turns, confusing chambers, and passages that seemed to lead nowhere. Anyone entering its depths would quickly lose all sense of direction. The deeper a person walked, the more difficult it became to remember the path back. Perhaps there were cold stone walls on every side. Perhaps the air was heavy and still. Only the faint light from an oil lamp might reveal the next doorway, while every footstep echoed through the darkness. At the center of this maze lived the Minotaur. There, hidden from the outside world, the creature waited. The story then moves across the sea to Athens. According to the legend, one of the sons of King Minos died while visiting the Athenian mainland. Different versions of the story explain his death in different ways, but Minos blamed the people of Athens. The Cretan king gathered his forces and went to war. Athens was defeated. As part of the city's punishment, Minos demanded a terrible tribute. At regular intervals, the Athenians were required to send 14 young people to Crete. 7 were young men. 7 were young women. They were chosen from among the finest youths of Athens, and placed aboard a ship bound for the island. When they arrived, they were taken to the labyrinth. There, they were abandoned inside the maze as an offering to the Minotaur. The tribute served two purposes. It fed the creature, and it reminded the Athenians that their city remained under the power of Crete. Year after year, the families of Athens watched their children leave. The ship sailed across the sea, and the young passengers were never expected to return. Eventually, however, a hero stepped forward. His name was Theseus. Theseus was the son of the king of Athens. When the time came for another group of young people to be sent to Crete, he volunteered to travel with them. He promised his father and the people of Athens that he would enter the labyrinth, kill the Minotaur, and bring the cruel tribute to an end. The voyage to Crete must have seemed long and uncertain. The ship moved southward across the Mediterranean, carrying Theseus and the other young Athenians toward an island known for its wealth, its powerful king, and its mysterious palace. When Theseus arrived at Knossos, he was brought before King Minos. There, the king's daughter, Princess Ariadne, saw him. According to the legend, Ariadne immediately fell in love with the young Athenian hero. She knew that if Theseus entered the labyrinth without help, he would almost certainly die. The maze was too complicated. Even if he managed to defeat the Minotaur, he would never find the way out again. So Ariadne decided to help him. She met Theseus in secret and gave him two important objects. The first was a sharp sword, strong enough to be used against the creature. The second was far simpler. It was a ball of thread. When the heavy doors of the labyrinth were opened, Theseus tied one end of the thread near the entrance. Then he began to walk. As he moved deeper into the maze, he slowly unwound the thread behind him. The passageways twisted and divided. Some corridors ended suddenly. Others turned back toward places he had already passed. The stone walls blocked the daylight, and the darkness grew thicker around him. Far away, somewhere within the heart of the labyrinth, the sound of the Minotaur echoed through the corridors. Theseus continued forward. The thread stretched behind him, marking the path home. At last, in the deepest part of the maze, he found the creature. There, surrounded by shadow and stone, the hero and the Minotaur faced one another. The struggle that followed was fierce, but Theseus eventually defeated the beast with the sword Ariadne had given him. The Minotaur fell. For the first time in many years, the center of the labyrinth became silent. Theseus did not escape the labyrinth by sight. The corridors around him remained dark, twisting through the stone in ways that would have confused even the strongest memory. Instead, he reached for the thin line of thread that Ariadne had given him. With one hand, he followed it carefully. The thread stretched back through the maze, passing around corners, along narrow passageways, and through the deep silence that now filled the labyrinth. Step by step, Theseus retraced his path. At last, he found the great entrance once again. He emerged from the darkness and escaped from Crete with the other young Athenians. The tribute had come to an end. The monster was dead, and the hero had survived. And there, for many centuries, the story seemed to finish. For almost 3,000 years, this myth of gods, heroes, curses, and monsters was nearly all that people knew about the ancient world of Crete. The tale was so powerful and so filled with supernatural events that it seemed unlikely that any real history could exist beneath it. Yet, beneath the olive groves and quiet hills of the island, another story was waiting. It did not wait for a hero carrying a sword. It waited for an archaeologist carrying a spade. By the end of the 19th century, Europe had entered a new age of discovery. Scholars were beginning to examine the ancient world in a different way. Ruins were no longer seen only as places of legend. They became sources of evidence. Broken pottery, buried walls, inscriptions, and forgotten objects could be studied carefully, layer by layer, until the past slowly began to speak again. It was during this period that a wealthy and highly confident English scholar named Arthur Evans became interested in Crete. Evans was an educated man with wide interests and considerable personal resources. He served as keeper of the Ashmolean Museum at the University of Oxford, one of the oldest and most respected museums in Britain. At first, however, he was not searching for the labyrinth. He was searching for something quieter and more difficult to understand: a lost system of writing. Evans had become fascinated by a number of small seal stones that appeared in the markets of Athens. They were pale in color, often creamy or milky white, and were small enough to be carried easily in the hand. Each one had been carefully carved with strange symbols. The marks did not resemble the familiar letters of classical Greek. They seemed older, more mysterious, and perhaps connected to a forgotten form of writing that had existed long before the Greek alphabet. Women on Crete called these objects milk stones. Some wore them as protective amulets, believing they brought luck, health, or fertility. To the villagers, they belonged partly to tradition and partly to mystery. To Arthur Evans, they were evidence. He believed that the symbols carved into the stones might belong to the earliest writing system in Europe. The possibility fascinated him. If he could discover where the stones had come from, perhaps he could find the people who had created them. And if he could find their ruins, perhaps the lost language itself might still be waiting there. So, Evans followed the trail toward Crete. During the 1890s, he arrived on an island that was still changing after many centuries of Ottoman rule. Crete was rugged and dramatic, with high mountains, fertile valleys, scattered villages, and long coastlines washed by the Mediterranean Sea. Evans did not travel across the island like an ordinary visitor. He moved through the countryside more like a detective. He spoke with villagers, searched local markets, and purchased additional seal stones whenever he found them. Each object offered another clue. Gradually, the evidence began to point toward one particular place. Near the city of Heraklion stood a broad hill called Kephala. At first glance, it did not appear extraordinary. The slopes were covered with olive trees and dry soil. The hill seemed quiet, ordinary, and firmly rooted in the peaceful rhythm of the Cretan countryside. Yet, beneath that land, massive ancient walls were believed to exist. Some scholars had already suspected that Kephala might mark the location of ancient Knossos, the palace associated in legend with King Minos. Among those who had shown interest was Heinrich Schliemann, the famous excavator connected with the discovery of Troy. Schliemann had demonstrated that places remembered in ancient poetry could sometimes have a real archaeological foundation. He had hoped to investigate Knossos as well, but negotiations, ownership disputes, local politics, and other practical difficulties prevented him from completing the work. Arthur Evans faced many of the same problems. However, he possessed two things that made him unusually persistent. The first was an intense academic obsession. The second was personal wealth. Where others had seen endless obstacles, Evans saw a mystery that could eventually be solved. He negotiated patiently with the owners of the land. The process took time, but he refused to abandon the project. Eventually, he purchased the entire site. The hill of Kephala belonged to him, along with anything that might remain beneath its soil. At last, in March of the year 1900, the excavation began. Evans arrived with a large team of more than 100 local workers. The olive trees had been cleared from the main area. Tools were prepared, baskets were arranged, and the surface of the hill stood open beneath the spring sky. There must have been a powerful sense of expectation. For thousands of years, the labyrinth had existed only in the imagination. It had been remembered as a place of darkness, confusion, and fear, hidden beneath the palace of a legendary king. Now Arthur Evans stood before a simple hill of earth and stone. He was ready to open a door into the lost world beneath it. The early work was difficult. The workers removed soil, roots, loose stone, and thick layers of debris that had accumulated across the centuries. Dust rose into the air as pickaxes and shovels moved steadily through the ground. The sun warmed the exposed earth, and the sounds of digging carried across the hillside. During the first days, the excavation revealed the upper sections of large, ancient walls. The walls suggested a structure of considerable size, but they gave little indication of what kind of building had once stood there. Perhaps it was only a fortress. Perhaps it had been a large residence. Or perhaps it was something far more important. A quiet tension settled over the site. Every newly uncovered stone raised another question. Then, suddenly, the earth offered a flash of color. A workman's tool struck an area of softer material. The digging stopped. The soil was removed more carefully, and beneath it appeared a fragment of painted plaster. The colors had survived underground for thousands of years. As the workers brushed away more earth, the image slowly became clearer. It showed a young man painted almost at life size. He had long, flowing black hair, a calm and noble profile, and a slender figure. In his hands, he carried a tall, narrow vessel. The image later became known as the cup-bearer fresco. Its discovery changed the entire mood of the excavation. This was not the work of a simple or undeveloped society. The figure had been created with confidence and grace. The artist understood movement, proportion, color, and decoration. The painting belonged to a culture with skilled craftsmen, organized workshops, and a deep appreciation for beauty. The bright plaster had survived beneath the ground while generations passed above it. Now, after centuries of darkness, the young cupbearer appeared once again beneath the Mediterranean light. Encouraged by the discovery, Evans and his workers followed the nearby walls. Before long, they uncovered a small sunken chamber. The room had remained surprisingly well preserved. Along its walls were benches made from gypsum, a soft, pale stone that reflected the light with a faint and almost luminous quality. Then the workers noticed something set against the northern wall. It was a throne. The seat had been carved from a single block of gypsum. Its shape was simple but elegant. The high back curved gently with a flowing outline that gave it a quiet sense of dignity. The chamber itself was not large, yet the throne made the room feel formal and important. It suggested ceremony. It suggested authority. It suggested that important gatherings had once taken place there, perhaps in the presence of priests, rulers, or sacred officials. As the walls were cleaned, more painted decoration began to appear. The chamber seemed to awaken. Stylized plants and palm-like forms spread across the plaster. Around the throne were delicate, natural patterns and flowers. Most striking of all were two griffins. These mythical creatures had the bodies of lions and the heads and wings of birds of prey. They rested calmly on either side of the throne. They did not appear violent. Instead, they seemed still and watchful, like supernatural guardians protecting the empty seat. Around them were painted lilies, adding softness and color to the room. The throne stood alone between the griffins. Its owner had vanished long ago, but the arrangement still carried a strong sense of ritual and power. Arthur Evans had spent years studying ancient legends. To him, the meaning of the discovery seemed obvious. He believed he had entered the palace of Knossos, and now, in this small chamber decorated with mythical guardians, he believed he had found the throne room of King Minos himself. With great confidence, Evans announced his conclusion to the world. The legendary ruler of Crete, he believed, had once sat in this very room. It was a dramatic claim. But the excavation was only beginning. Around the same time, another important clue emerged from the earth. As the excavation continued, another symbol began to appear again and again. It had been carved into the great stone blocks of the palace walls. The shape was simple but unmistakable. A double-headed axe. Workers found it in many parts of the site, cut carefully into pillars, blocks, and architectural surfaces. The symbol seemed to belong deeply to the identity of the building. Arthur Evans recognized it as a sacred object known as the labrys. The double axe had appeared in ancient religious imagery, and Evans believed it carried an important ceremonial meaning. Then a connection occurred to him. He began to link the word labrys with the ancient word labyrinth. Perhaps, he suggested, the labyrinth of the myth had not originally meant a maze at all. Perhaps its name referred to the palace itself. The Palace of the Double Axe. It was a bold interpretation, and one that would shape the way Evans understood nearly everything he uncovered at Knossos. In only a few weeks, the discoveries had already become extraordinary. There was a throne room decorated with griffins and lilies. There were frescoes painted with skill and confidence. There were sacred symbols carved throughout the palace. And now, there appeared to be a possible linguistic connection between the building and the oldest legend associated with Crete. Evans had arrived on the island hoping to find a few examples of ancient writing. Instead, he believed he had found the seat of a forgotten ruler and the historical foundation of the labyrinth itself. With every basket of soil removed from the hill, the myth seemed to move a little closer to reality. Yet the throne room was only the beginning. As Evans and his teams returned over the following seasons, the true scale of the site slowly became visible. They had not uncovered a single chamber. They had not found an ordinary royal house. They were revealing an immense architectural complex whose size and complexity were difficult to comprehend. The excavation spread across approximately 6 acres. New walls appeared in every direction. Rooms opened into corridors. Corridors led toward staircases. Staircases descended into deeper levels, or rose toward terraces that had once stood above the surrounding countryside. The structure was less like a single building, and more like a small city gathered beneath one roof. At its center was a broad, rectangular court. This large paved space was open to the sky and formed the heart of the entire palace. Sunlight would have fallen across its stones during the day. In the evening, long shadows may have stretched from the surrounding walls and columns. This central court was probably one of the most important public spaces in Minoan life. Here, people may have gathered for religious ceremonies, festivals, processions, and public displays. Priestesses might have crossed the court carrying sacred objects. Musicians may have played while groups moved slowly through the open space. Crowds may have watched ceremonies connected with bulls, including the famous athletic performances shown in Minoan art. These scenes, often called bull leaping, depict young men and women approaching or vaulting over powerful animals. The activity was dangerous, but it also seems to have carried religious and ceremonial meaning. Around the central court spread a bewildering arrangement of rooms, halls, shrines, storerooms, workshops, and private quarters. More than 1,000 rooms were eventually identified within the palace complex. At first glance, the arrangement seemed almost chaotic. Yet, the more carefully it was studied, the clearer it became that the palace had been planned with great intelligence. It had grown over time, but its builders understood the slope of the land and used it skillfully. The palace descended along the gentle side of Kephala Hill. Some sections rose several stories above others. In places, the building may have reached as many as 5 levels in height. Balconies, terraces, verandas, and columned passages created a constantly changing landscape of light and shadow. From one level, a person might look down into a courtyard. From another, they might step onto a terrace overlooking the surrounding fields. Grand staircases connected the different floors. One of the most impressive was the Great Staircase. It descended through several levels toward the more luxurious residential areas of the palace. The staircase was not dark and enclosed. Instead, it was illuminated by one of the most ingenious features of Minoan architecture: the light well. A light well was an open vertical space built into the structure. It allowed sunlight and fresh air to travel deep into the interior of the palace. Even rooms far from the outer walls could receive natural light. Air could circulate through spaces that might otherwise have felt heavy and closed. This made the enormous building more comfortable and alive. As archaeologists walked through the uncovered corridors, they began to understand why later generations might have remembered Knossos as a labyrinth. There was no single obvious entrance leading directly into one great hall. Instead, the palace unfolded gradually. Long corridors turned sharply without warning. A passage might descend a staircase, cross a landing, then rise again toward another level. A visitor could move through a row of columns and suddenly enter a small hidden courtyard. Another doorway might lead into a narrow room, then into a broad chamber beyond. The palace was likely easy to navigate for those who lived and worked there. They would have known its routes, its staircases, and its private spaces. But to a stranger, it could feel deeply confusing. A person unfamiliar with the building might quickly lose all sense of direction. Arthur Evans believed this physical reality had helped create the ancient story of the labyrinth. Yet the palace was not a prison. It was not built to hide a monster. It was a crowded, active center supporting the life of an entire civilization. Different areas of the complex served different purposes. Some sections were ceremonial, others were residential. Some were used for production, storage, administration, or worship. In the areas Evans called the royal apartments, archaeologists found elegant rooms that may have belonged to members of the ruling household or important religious figures. One chamber became famous for its painted dolphins. The animals appeared to swim across the wall in a bright marine scene, surrounded by smaller fish and decorative patterns. The image gives the room a peaceful quality, as though the sea itself had entered the palace. Nearby, archaeologists found evidence of an advanced drainage and sanitation system. Among the discoveries was a toilet connected to a network of terracotta pipes. Water could be guided through channels beneath the palace, carrying waste away and helping to keep the parts of the building clean. This was a remarkable achievement for the Bronze Age. The Minoans had also developed systems for collecting rainwater and moving it through the palace. Their engineers understood how to control the flow of water across different levels. Elsewhere in the complex were workshops. Potters shaped clay into vessels of many sizes. Painters prepared plaster and pigments for frescoes. Stoneworkers carved bowls, seals, and decorative objects. Jewelers created ornaments from gold and other valuable materials. The palace was not only a center of rule, it was also a place of constant production. The sounds of work must once have filled these areas. Clay turned beneath skilled hands. Stone tools tapped against harder surfaces. Metal was heated, shaped, and polished. Pigments were mixed before being carried to freshly prepared walls. In the great storage rooms, known as magazines, archaeologists found evidence of the palace's enormous economic power. The rooms were lined with giant clay jars called pithoi. Some were tall enough to reach the shoulders of an adult. They were used to store large quantities of olive oil, wine, grain, and other valuable goods. Together, the storage capacity of the palace may have exceeded 200,000 gallons. These supplies represented far more than food for a single household. They were part of a larger system of collection, control, and redistribution. Farmers and villages may have brought produce to the palace. Officials recorded what arrived. Scribes kept accounts. Priests, administrators, and rulers oversaw the movement of goods through the wider region. The palace stood at the center of this network. It gathered the wealth of the surrounding land and helped distribute it again. This required careful organization. It required trained workers, records, authority, and a large bureaucracy. Knossos was therefore not simply a home for a royal family. It was the administrative, economic, religious, and artistic heart of Minoan society. Thousands of people may have depended on its daily activity. The ruling household lived there. Priests and priestesses conducted ceremonies. Artisans produced fine objects. Scribes recorded goods and transactions. Servants, laborers, guards, messengers, and officials moved constantly through the corridors. Arthur Evans had uncovered far more than a palace. He had revealed the complex inner structure of a lost civilization. Yet, as the scale of the site became clearer, another mystery emerged. It was a mystery created not by what had been found, but by what was missing. The Bronze Age was often a violent period. Powerful kingdoms surrounded themselves with defenses. The cities of the Hittites were protected by massive gates and stone walls. The Egyptians built forts to guard important borders and routes. Across the ancient world, rulers expected attack and prepared for war. But the great Minoan palace centers seemed remarkably open. There were no enormous ramparts surrounding Knossos. There were no towering defensive walls. There were no fortified gates designed to stop an invading army. The same pattern appeared at other important Minoan sites. This absence did not seem accidental. It appeared to be a deliberate feature of their architecture. The Minoans had built places filled with wealth, stored goods, workshops, sacred objects, and important people. Yet they had not enclosed them behind the kind of defenses used by nearly every other major power of the age. This openness made Minoan society appear unusual. Perhaps the island was protected by the sea. Perhaps its rulers trusted the strength of their ships. Perhaps they enjoyed a long period of stability and did not expect enemies to reach their shores. Whatever the reason, their palaces were built with a sense of confidence rather than fear. Their architecture opened toward courtyards, terraces, light wells, and the surrounding landscape. And from this absence of walls, archaeologists began to imagine a society that may have been more peaceful than many of its neighbors. The palace at Knossos was not built like a fortress standing above the people. It did not dominate the surrounding landscape with walls, towers, and guarded gates. Instead, it seems to have opened naturally into the town around it. The great western court may have served as a public gathering place, something like a broad square where people could meet, wait, trade, watch ceremonies, or prepare for processions entering the palace. Its entrances were not designed to stop an enemy. They were designed to receive movement. Groups could approach in an orderly way, carrying offerings, sacred objects, food, or goods from the countryside. This same pattern appeared at other major palace centers across Crete, including Phaistos and Malea. The repetition suggests that the island experienced a long period of internal stability. Unlike many other regions of the ancient world, Crete does not appear to have been divided by constant civil war between rival fortified cities. For centuries, the island may have enjoyed what later scholars called the Pax Minoica, the Minoan peace. This long stability allowed a distinctive culture to grow. Resources that might have been spent on walls, weapons, and defensive towers could instead be directed toward architecture, art, craft production, trade, and ceremony. Yet internal peace alone does not fully explain the confidence of the Minoans. Even if Crete was calm within, enemies could still have arrived from beyond the island. The answer to the mystery of the missing walls was probably not found on land. It was found at sea. The Minoans became the first great maritime power of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Their safety depended on something more flexible than stone. It depended on ships. A large and organized fleet may have protected the island, controlled important sea routes, and carried Minoan influence far beyond Crete. Some of the most vivid evidence for this seafaring world comes from the nearby island of Thera, known today as Santorini. There, volcanic ash preserved remarkable wall paintings. Among them is the famous flotilla fresco. It shows a procession of long, elegant ships moving across the water between coastal towns. The vessels have raised prows, decorated hulls, and crews seated in careful rows. Some appear ceremonial. Others may have carried soldiers, traders, officials, or travelers. The scene feels peaceful, but it also reveals a society deeply at home on the sea. These ships were not used only for war. They were the moving foundation of a wide trading network. Minoan merchants traveled through the Aegean islands and reached the shores of mainland Greece. Their contacts extended south toward Egypt and east toward the kingdoms and ports of the Near East. They carried olive oil, wine, pottery, textiles, metalwork, and fine luxury goods. In return, they brought home raw materials, precious objects, new ideas, and artistic influences. The sea connected Crete to the wider world. It also protected it. The Minoan fleet may have functioned as the island's true defensive wall. Warships could patrol the sea lanes. Merchant vessels could carry information between ports. Potential enemies might be detected and intercepted long before they reached the Cretan coast. A stone wall remains in one place. A navy can move. It can respond. It can guard distant routes, protect trade, and project power across many islands at once. This maritime strength allowed the Minoans to look outward. Their attention was drawn toward the horizon rather than turned inward by fear. They did not need to surround every palace with heavy fortifications if their ships already controlled the approaches to the island. Their confidence appeared in the choices they made. Instead of building grim walls, they created open courts, painted chambers, elegant staircases, and ceremonial halls. They invested in beauty. The uniqueness of this approach becomes especially clear when we compare the Minoans with the civilization that later rose to power on the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaean world was built around defense. Their major centers, including Mycenae and Tiryns, stood on high ground behind enormous stone walls. These were citadels made to survive attack. The masonry was built from massive, roughly shaped boulders placed together in walls of extraordinary thickness. Centuries later, the Greeks who saw these ruins found it difficult to believe that ordinary people could have moved such stones. They imagined that the walls had been constructed by the Cyclopes, the giant one-eyed beings of mythology. For this reason, the style became known as Cyclopean masonry. Inside these fortified centers, the architecture felt more controlled and defensive. Narrow approaches led toward guarded entrances. Royal buildings stood protected behind walls. The entire design reflected a world where rulers expected danger from rival kingdoms and neighboring armies. Life in such a place may have felt enclosed. The walls offered safety, but they also revealed anxiety. The open palaces of the Minoans, by contrast, should not be understood as weak or careless. Their lack of fortifications was probably a statement of strength. It suggested a civilization so secure in its command of the sea that it did not need to retreat behind stone. The palace at Knossos expressed confidence through openness. It faced the world rather than hiding from it. This was the architectural signature of a powerful Bronze Age society whose identity was shaped by travel, trade, ceremony, and the sea. It also created a striking contrast with the more violent, fortified world that would eventually follow. And if the walls of the Minoan palaces could still speak, they would not speak in gray stone alone. They would speak in color. The Minoans were extraordinary masters of fresco painting. A fresco is created by applying pigment directly onto fresh, wet lime plaster. As the plaster dries, the colors become chemically bound to the wall. The image is not simply placed on the surface. It becomes part of the architecture itself. This technique is beautiful but demanding. The painter must work quickly. There's only a limited amount of time before the plaster begins to dry. Mistakes are difficult to correct. Lines must be placed with confidence, and colors must be prepared in advance. The artist has to understand the design clearly before beginning. The survival of these paintings for more than 3,000 years reveals the remarkable skill of the people who created them. Even after walls collapsed and rooms filled with soil, traces of blue, red, white, yellow, and black remained hidden beneath the earth. To walk through the excavated palace at Knossos is to move among the fragments of a vanished artistic world. Some figures survive only as a hand, a face, a flower, or a fold of clothing. Others have been carefully reconstructed from scattered pieces. Together, they offer brief glimpses of the people who once lived there. One of the grandest examples is the procession fresco. It once decorated an important entrance route into the palace. The painting showed a long line of graceful young people moving forward in ceremonial order. They appeared against a deep red background. Many had long, curling black hair. They wore carefully decorated kilts and carried vessels that may have been used in religious rituals. Their movement seems slow and formal. They are not shown rushing. Instead, they advance with dignity, as though approaching a sacred ceremony. Among them is the famous cup-bearer. He is painted at nearly life-size. In his hands, he carries a tall, conical vessel known as a rhyton, a container used during ritual or ceremonial occasions. His profile is calm. His posture is controlled. He seems to welcome the viewer into the formal life of the palace. In the more private residential areas, the mood of the art becomes softer. The scenes feel closer to everyday pleasure and the natural world. In a room Arthur Evans named the Queen's Megaron, archaeologists uncovered one of the best-known works of Minoan art, the dolphin fresco. In this bright and flowing scene, blue dolphins leap and turn through a stylized sea. Smaller fish swim around them. Sea urchins appear below, their sharp forms scattered through the water. The dolphins seem almost weightless. They rise and dive with a sense of freedom, surrounded by the creatures of the Mediterranean. The painting is joyful. It celebrates the marine world that supported life on Crete and connected the island to distant places. There is little stiffness in the composition. The animals move naturally through the scene. Their curved bodies create a gentle rhythm across the wall, like waves passing through sunlight. This closeness to nature appears again and again in Minoan art. Flowers open across painted surfaces. Birds rest among plants. Monkeys move through rocky landscapes. Fish, shells, octopuses, and dolphins decorate rooms and pottery. The artists seemed interested not only in power and ceremony, but also in the living world around them. Another famous image from Knossos survives only as a small fragment. It shows the face of a young woman. Arthur Evans gave her a modern nickname, La Parisienne. He chose this name because her appearance seemed unexpectedly elegant and sophisticated, almost like a fashionable woman from Paris in his own time. She is shown in profile. Her eye is large and carefully outlined. Her lips are painted red. Dark curls fall around her face, and a decorative knot appears at the back of her clothing. Only a small part of the original image remains, yet the expression feels alive. She seems poised, confident, and aware of the world around her. Across more than 3,000 years, her painted face still carries a quiet sense of individuality. Her hair is arranged in elaborate curls. A large, darkly outlined eye dominates her profile, while a faint and almost playful smile rests upon her bright red lips. At the back of her neck, she wears a distinctive sacred knot, a symbol that may have carried religious meaning. She offers us a brief and fascinating glimpse into the world of the Minoan elite. Yet we do not know her identity. She may have represented a goddess. Perhaps she was a priestess taking part in a sacred ceremony. She may even have been a queen or another important woman connected to the palace. The surviving fragment gives us no certain answer. Her expression remains calm and mysterious, suspended somewhere between ordinary human life and the sacred world of the gods. Over time, her painted face has become one of the most recognizable symbols of Minoan civilization. She seems both familiar and distant. Her clothing, hairstyle, and cosmetics suggest a refined society, with carefully developed ideas about beauty and status. Yet her true name, position, and story have disappeared completely. She looks out from the broken plaster, carrying a secret that can no longer be recovered. No exploration of Minoan art, however, would be complete without the famous bull-leaping fresco. From a purely artistic perspective, it is a remarkable achievement. The painting captures a single moment of movement, frozen against the wall. A large bull charges forward with its head lowered and its body stretched powerfully across the scene. Around it are three slender athletes. One figure stands near the bull's horns. Another appears to be turning through the air above the animal's back. The third waits behind the bull, perhaps ready to catch the leaping athlete as the movement ends. The scene is filled with balance and motion. The animal appears strong and heavy, while the human figures are light, graceful, and controlled. The artist used the color conventions common in the ancient Mediterranean world. The male athlete was painted with reddish-brown skin. The two female athletes were shown with pale, white skin. This difference helped ancient viewers distinguish the participants clearly, even though their bodies and clothing were otherwise similar. Whether such bull leaping occurred exactly as shown remains uncertain. It may have been a real athletic performance. It may have carried deep religious meaning. Perhaps it was connected to seasonal celebrations, initiation rituals, or ceremonies honoring a god or goddess associated with the bull. Whatever its precise purpose, the image suggests courage, discipline, and careful training. The participants are not shown attacking the animal. Instead, they move with it. The scene resembles a sacred dance between human beings and one of the most powerful creatures in the Minoan world. When we examine the visual language of Minoan art as a whole, what is absent can be as revealing as what appears. The frescoes show people who admired the natural world. They painted plants, animals, sea creatures, mountains, and flowers. They showed processions, offerings, festivals, athletic displays, and religious ceremonies. They valued flowing movement, elegant clothing, bright color, and graceful human figures. Yet their art does not resemble the royal images created by many other ancient societies. In Egyptian art, pharaohs are often shown larger than everyone around them, defeating enemies or standing beside the gods. In Assyrian palaces, kings appear in scenes of battle, conquest, and hunting, surrounded by soldiers and defeated opponents. Minoan frescoes offer something very different. There are no surviving palace scenes that clearly celebrate one all-powerful ruler. There are no great images of armies marching into war. There are no long rows of prisoners or fallen enemies. Weapons are not the central subject. Military conquest does not dominate the walls. Instead, the paintings are filled with movement, ceremony, nature, and life. They present the image of a society that was prosperous, confident, and perhaps comparatively peaceful. Of course, art does not always show the complete truth. A civilization may choose to paint the world as it wishes to be remembered, rather than as it truly was. There may have been conflict, inequality, and hardship that never appeared on palace walls. Still, the artistic choices made by the Minoans remained significant. Their walls celebrated life rather than destruction. Because much of their written language remains unreadable, these frescoes are among the clearest voices the Minoans left behind. It is a voice spoken through color, gesture, rhythm, and form. It is beautiful and refined, but it cannot answer every question. The paintings show us what the Minoans valued, or at least what their artists and palace leaders chose to display. They do not tell us the names of the people in the scenes. They do not explain the ceremonies. They do not identify the gods. Their deepest meanings remain silent. The frescoes of Knossos reveal a world of grand rituals and a close connection to the landscape of Crete. Yet Minoan creativity was not limited to the walls of palaces. Perhaps their extraordinary skill becomes even clearer when we look at the smaller objects they created. These were pieces that could be carried, touched, worn, traded, or used during daily life. The same love of motion that appeared in their paintings was placed onto pottery. It was carved into seal stones. It was shaped into jewelry and metalwork. The Minoans did not simply hang art around them as decoration. They lived among beautiful objects. Art entered their storerooms, workshops, kitchens, ceremonies, clothing, and personal belongings. Even useful objects were given careful shapes and flowing designs. The Minoans became masters of the potter's wheel. With it, they produced vessels that were remarkably balanced, delicate, and thin. Some were so finely made that their walls have often been compared to the shell of an egg. During the early palace period, Minoan workshops developed a style of pottery that became highly valued across the eastern Mediterranean. Examples have been found far beyond Crete, including in Egypt and the Near East. This style is known as Kamares ware. Kamares vessels are famous for their thin walls and bold decoration. The potter usually covered the surface of the vessel with a dark, glossy slip, creating a background that appeared almost black. Over this dark surface, artists painted designs in white, red, orange, and sometimes other warm colors. Spirals turned around the curved sides. Rosettes opened like flowers. Lines twisted into waves. Stylized plants, petals, and abstract shapes flowed across the surface. The patterns do not remain still. They seem to move around the vessel. As the object is slowly turned in the hands, the decoration changes, revealing new curves and arrangements. The art is highly controlled, yet it also feels energetic and free. Some patterns are so fluid and complex that they appear almost hypnotic. They reflect the same Minoan interest in rhythm and movement that can be seen in the palace frescoes. During the later Minoan period, pottery decoration gradually changed. The love of abstract pattern remained, but artists began to look even more closely at the natural world. This development produced what archaeologists call the marine style. It became one of the finest expressions of the Minoan relationship with the sea. On these vessels, potters often left the background in the pale natural color of the clay. The sea creatures and plants were then painted in a rich, dark slip. Octopuses, shells, rocks, seaweed, coral-like forms, and sea urchins spread across the pottery. The decoration was not placed inside rigid borders. Instead, it followed the shape of the vessel. One of the most famous examples is the octopus flask discovered at Palai Castro in eastern Crete. The vessel itself is relatively small, yet its design has become one of the most recognizable images of Minoan art. A large octopus spreads across its rounded surface. Its head rests near the center, while its 8 long tentacles curve outward. The arms twist naturally around the body of the flask. They follow its swelling shape so perfectly that the painted creature and the vessel seem to belong together. The octopus does not look trapped inside a decorative frame. It appears to embrace the object. The empty spaces are filled with smaller details. Seaweed drifts between the tentacles. Sea urchins, rocks, and other marine forms complete the underwater scene. The artist clearly understood the movement of an octopus. Its arms curl in different directions, creating a feeling of living motion. Holding the vessel must have felt almost like holding a small piece of the Aegean Sea. The entire surface becomes a quiet underwater world. The same astonishing attention to detail appears on an even smaller scale in Minoan seal stones. These were the milk stones that first captured Arthur Evans's imagination and brought him to Crete. Many were carved from valuable stones such as agate, carnelian, and jasper. They were small enough to be worn around the neck, attached to clothing, or carried in a pouch. Some could easily fit between 2 fingers. Yet the scenes carved into them are incredibly detailed. When examined closely, the tiny images open like windows into the Minoan world. Some show priestesses standing with their arms raised during religious rituals. Others show powerful bulls, mythical griffins, birds, lions, or leaping dolphins. There are scenes of worship, movement, hunting, and ceremony. Some seals even include detailed images of long, elegant ships with high prows. The artists worked across surfaces that were only a few centimeters wide. They carved human figures, animals, clothing, hair, weapons, buildings, and ships with extraordinary precision. A slight mistake could have ruined the entire image. The work required steady hands, sharp tools, patience, and remarkable eyesight. These seal stones were not only decorative objects, they also served a practical purpose. Minoan society depended on administration, storage, and the movement of goods. A seal could be pressed into soft clay placed over a container, doorway, package, or document. The image left by the stone acted like a personal signature. It showed who had approved, closed, inspected, or controlled the object. A broken seal might reveal that a container had been opened. In this way, a tiny carved stone became part of the palace bureaucracy. It could identify an official, merchant, priest, administrator, or member of an important family. The same object could therefore be useful, valuable, symbolic, and beautiful. From the largest palace fresco to the smallest carved seal, the work of Minoan artists carries a recognizable character. Their designs rarely feel rigid or lifeless. Plants curl, animals leap, ships glide across the sea. Human bodies bend, turn, and move through ceremonies. Even abstract patterns seem to flow like waves. Their art reveals a constant fascination with the natural world. It shows a people who observed animals, plants, and the sea carefully, then transformed what they saw into graceful forms. Their craftsmanship reached a level that few other Bronze Age societies could match. The Minoans filled both grand and ordinary parts of life with art. A ceremonial chamber could be painted with griffins and lilies. A storage jar could carry a complex pattern. A drinking vessel could become an underwater world. A personal seal could contain a complete religious scene. Beauty was not reserved only for monumental buildings. It appeared in objects used by human hands. Through these works, we can sense a civilization with a refined and joyful understanding of form, color, and movement. Yet beneath all this beauty lies a deep and persistent silence. To understand the Minoans is to stand before a culture that left behind thousands of objects, paintings, symbols, and buildings, but very few words that we can clearly read. Their world surrounds us in fragments, but the people themselves remain just beyond our reach. At the center of Minoan civilization lies a profound silence. The Egyptians left behind funerary writings such as the Book of the Dead. The people of Mesopotamia recorded stories of gods, kings, creation, and catastrophe in long poems pressed into clay tablets. The Minoans also wrote. Thousands of inscribed tablets, seals, and objects have survived. Yet the script used for their language, known today as Linear A, has never been fully deciphered. Their words remain visible, but their voices remain beyond our understanding. Perhaps the tablets contain lists of goods, offerings, names, or religious ceremonies. Perhaps somewhere among those carefully marked signs are prayers once spoken in palace shrines, or stories about the gods who watched over Crete. For now, we cannot read them with certainty. No great Minoan religious text has reached us in a language we understand. There is no surviving book that clearly describes how they believed the world began, what happened after death, or which divine beings governed the sea, the sky, and the fertile earth. Their prayers remain hidden within an unreadable script. Their sacred stories have faded into silence. To understand the spiritual world of the Minoans, archaeologists must therefore look elsewhere. They study the places where people gathered. They examine figurines, seals, pottery, frescoes, stone vessels, offerings, and ritual objects. Each discovery provides a small clue, though rarely a complete explanation. Together, these objects suggest a religious world that was profoundly different from those of many neighboring civilizations. Minoan worship does not appear to have centered on enormous state temples like those of ancient Egypt. Nor did they build the great columned sanctuaries that would later become familiar in classical Greece. Their most sacred places were often quieter. Some stood high above the settlements, on mountain peaks beneath the open sky. Others lay deep inside the earth, within dark and ancient caves. The Minoans seem to have found the presence of the divine throughout the natural landscape. Mountains, caves, trees, stones, animals, and springs may all have carried sacred meaning. The gods were not separated completely from the living world. They seemed to exist within it. Across the highest areas of Crete, archaeologists have discovered what are now called peak sanctuaries. These places were usually positioned on mountains or high ridges overlooking the surrounding countryside. One of the most important stood on Mount Juctas, rising above the region near Knossos. From its slopes, the land spreads outward in wide, distant views. Villages, fields, valleys, and hills lie below, while the sea can be seen beyond the island's northern coast. For ancient worshippers, the journey upward may have been part of the religious experience. They would have left the comfort of their homes and climbed slowly along rough paths. The ground beneath their feet would have been dry and uneven. The sunlight could be strong, and the wind would have grown cooler as they moved higher. Perhaps families climbed together. Perhaps small groups carried baskets containing food, drink, incense, or tiny clay figures. The walk may have taken several hours. With each step, the noises of the settlement below would have become quieter. At the summit, the worshippers entered a simple, open-air sacred space. There were no enormous roofs or towering temple doors. The sky itself formed the ceiling. The mountain wind passed through the sanctuary, and the changing light moved across the stones. There, the people of Crete left offerings. Archaeologists have found thousands of small clay figurines at such sites. Many represent human beings standing in attitudes of prayer. Some figures raise their arms. Others hold their hands close to the body, or seem to present themselves before an unseen divine presence. The figurines are often simple. They may not show an individual face or detailed clothing. Yet each one may have represented a real person who made the difficult climb and placed the object carefully among the stones. Other offerings took the form of animals. Small clay cattle, sheep, goats, and other livestock were brought to the sanctuary. These animals were essential to daily life. They provided food, wool, milk, labor, and wealth. A farmer may have left a model of a bull or goat while asking the gods to protect the herd. Another worshipper may have prayed for healthy animals, fertile land, or favorable weather. Among the most personal offerings were clay models of parts of the human body. Archaeologists have found representations of arms, legs, heads, and other body parts. These objects were probably connected with healing. Someone suffering from pain or illness may have carried a small clay copy of the afflicted area up the mountain. The offering could then be left with a prayer. Perhaps the worshipper asked for relief. Perhaps the figurine was given in gratitude after healing had already taken place. The exact words of these prayers are lost. Still, the objects reveal something familiar. Behind the distant ceremonies of the Bronze Age were ordinary human hopes. People worried about their health. They wanted their children and animals to survive. They depended on the rain, the soil, and the changing seasons. They climbed mountains because they believed that somewhere above the fields and villages, a divine power might hear them. While some Minoan worship took place beneath the open sky, other ceremonies led deep below the surface of the island. Crete is filled with caves. Many open in the sides of mountains, where narrow entrances lead toward chambers shaped slowly by water and stone. To enter such a place is to leave the familiar world behind. The warm sunlight disappears. The air becomes cool and damp. Sounds change, and even a quiet footstep can echo through the darkness. Stalactites descend from the ceiling, while other formations rise from the cave floor. In the uncertain light of an oil lamp, these natural shapes may have appeared alive. The Minoans treated some caves as sacred spaces. People carried vessels, figurines, food, drink, weapons, jewelry, and other valuable objects into their interiors. Some offerings were placed in deep chambers far from daylight. The journey into the cave may have been slow and careful. A small flame would have illuminated only a few steps at a time. Smoke from torches or lamps gathered against the stone above, while water fell quietly somewhere in the darkness. These caves may have been understood as openings into the earth itself. They connected the ordinary human world with unseen powers below. The Minoans may have associated them with fertility, death, renewal, and the cycles of nature. Seeds disappear beneath the ground before new plants rise. The sun fades each evening and returns in the morning. The dry season gives way to rain. Human beings are born, grow older, and eventually return to the earth. Such natural cycles may have shaped Minoan religious thought. A cave could represent both darkness and creation. It could feel like a tomb, but also like a womb. A place of ending might also become a place of beginning. This reverence for the earth appears closely connected with one of the most striking features of Minoan religious art. Female figures appear with remarkable frequency. Across frescoes, engraved seal stones, rings, figurines, and other ritual objects, women are often shown occupying central and important positions. They lead processions. They stand before shrines. They receive offerings. They raise their arms in gestures of worship or divine appearance. Some are shown on elevated platforms, while smaller figures approach them from below. Others stand beside sacred trees, columns, animals, or architectural structures. Their clothing is often elaborate. Long skirts fall in layered or patterned shapes. The upper body may be covered by a fitted garment, while the hair is arranged in carefully styled curls. Jewelry, headdresses, and ceremonial objects distinguish them from the figures around them. We cannot always determine whether these women represent human priestesses or goddesses. A figure receiving offerings might be a divine being. It might also be a high-ranking woman conducting a ritual. In some scenes, the boundary between the human and sacred worlds appears deliberately unclear. A priestess may have represented a goddess during a ceremony. A woman standing before a shrine may have acted as an intermediary between the community and the divine. Whatever their precise identities, female figures repeatedly appear in positions of authority. Men are present as well, but they are often shown differently. They may carry offerings, play musical instruments, attend ceremonies, or stand before a more prominent female figure. Some appear as worshippers. Others take part in processions or athletic performances. This does not prove that every aspect of Minoan society was controlled by women. The surviving evidence is too incomplete for such certainty. Yet, it does suggest that women held unusually visible and important roles within Minoan religious life. They may have served as priestesses, ritual leaders, members of powerful families, or living representatives of the gods. The clearest image of this female-centered spiritual world emerged from a hidden place inside the palace of Knossos. During the excavation, Arthur Evans discovered 2 stone-lined containers beneath the floor of a religious area. He called them the temple repositories. The repositories had been carefully sealed. Inside were damaged ritual objects that may once have belonged to a palace sanctuary. Perhaps they had been placed there after an earthquake or another destructive event. Perhaps sacred items that could no longer be used were buried respectfully rather than thrown away. Among the objects were pieces of pottery, shells, stone items, tablets, and fragments of small figurines. Then the excavators uncovered something extraordinary: a group of female figures made from faience. Faience was a fine, glazed material with a smooth, shining surface. It could be colored in bright shades, allowing craftsmen to create small objects with remarkable detail. Although the figurines had been broken, many fragments survived. They were carefully collected and reconstructed. The figures wore elaborate Minoan clothing. Their long skirts spread downward in several decorated layers. Tight-fitting bodices surrounded their upper bodies, leaving the breasts exposed. Their waists were narrow, their posture upright, and their clothing rich with carefully shaped patterns. Most striking of all were the snakes. One figure holds a snake in each raised hand. The reptiles curve upward along her arms, their slender bodies forming flowing lines around her. Another figure is also associated with snakes and wears an elaborate headdress. The creatures do not appear to be attacking her. She holds them with complete confidence. They seem to belong to her sacred authority. Snakes carried many possible meanings in the ancient world. Because they move close to the ground and disappear into small openings, they could be linked with the earth and the world beneath it. Because they shed their skin, they could suggest renewal, transformation, and rebirth. They might also have been connected with household protection, fertility, healing, or the spirits of the dead. The true meaning of the Knossos figures remains uncertain. Arthur Evans believed that they represented powerful Minoan goddesses. The world soon came to know them as the snake goddesses. That name remains famous today, although we cannot be certain that the Minoans themselves would have understood the figures in exactly this way. They may represent goddesses. They may be priestesses carrying sacred animals. They may combine elements of both human ritual and divine power. Their original names are unknown. The prayers spoken before them have disappeared, yet their presence is unforgettable. They stand upright in their elaborate clothing, holding the creatures of the earth in raised hands. Their calm expressions reveal neither fear nor struggle. Instead, they seem to preside quietly over a world of fertility, nature, death, and renewal. Buried beneath the palace floor for thousands of years, they emerged as some of the most mysterious and powerful images ever discovered on Crete. And through them, the silent spiritual world of the Minoans begins, very slowly, to take shape. The most complete of the figures stands with her arms extended and her eyes opened wide. Her gaze is direct and intense. In each hand, she holds a twisting snake, while other serpents appear to coil around her body. She does not seem frightened by them. Instead, she controls them calmly, as though they belong naturally within the sacred world she represents. Her clothing reflects the height of Minoan fashion. She wears a fitted bodice that leaves her breasts exposed, together with a long, elaborate skirt formed from several decorated layers. The fabric appears heavy and formal, falling around her body in carefully shaped flounces. Upon her tall headdress rests a small feline. It may represent a leopard, cat, or another wild animal. The creature sits quietly above her, observing the world with the same still confidence as the woman beneath it. The complete image is one of remarkable authority. She seems powerful, composed, and mysterious, yet her true identity remains uncertain. She may have represented a goddess. She may have been a high-ranking priestess dressed for an important ritual. Perhaps she stood somewhere between the two, with a human priestess taking on the appearance and authority of a divine figure during a ceremony. Her symbols appear to belong to traditions deeply connected with nature, fertility, and the earth. Her exposed breasts have often been interpreted as signs of nourishment and life. They may suggest motherhood, fertility, and the ability of the natural world to sustain human beings. Like the fertile soil of Crete, she offers the promise of growth and renewal. The snakes add another layer of meaning. They live close to the ground and often disappear into cracks, holes, and hidden spaces beneath the earth. For this reason, many ancient peoples associated them with the underworld and with powers that existed below the visible surface of life. Snakes also shed their skin. They appear to leave an older form behind and emerge renewed. This natural process made them powerful symbols of transformation, healing, rebirth, and the return of life after death. The small feline upon the headdress may connect the figure to wild nature. It suggests authority over animals and the untamed world beyond the palace. In many ancient traditions, powerful female deities were shown beside lions, leopards, or other wild creatures. They were sometimes understood as mistresses of animals, divine beings who ruled over both the fertile land and the dangerous wilderness. When these symbols are considered together, the figure appears almost like a great mother goddess. She combines nourishment with mystery. She is connected to life, but also to the hidden world beneath the earth. She holds both fertility and death, growth and renewal, gentleness and wild power. Arthur Evans and many early archaeologists were deeply impressed by the importance of female figures in Minoan art. They noticed that women appeared at the center of ceremonies, processions, and sacred scenes. They saw priestesses receiving offerings, goddesses standing on raised platforms, and female figures surrounded by animals and worshippers. This led Evans to a bold conclusion. He believed that Minoan society may have been a matriarchy. In other words, he imagined a civilization in which women not only dominated religious life, but also held political and social power. The idea was striking. It seemed to offer a complete contrast with the later Greek world, where most formal authority belonged to men. The evidence remains fascinating. Minoan women are shown with a visibility and freedom that is unusual in the ancient Mediterranean. They appear in public ceremonies. They wear elaborate clothing. They take part in processions and athletic performances. They stand in positions of ritual importance. They are not always shown as quiet attendants beside powerful men. Very often, they appear to be the central figures themselves. Modern historians, however, approach the question more carefully. The surviving artwork reveals religious importance, but it cannot tell us exactly how political power was organized. A woman shown receiving offerings might be a goddess rather than a human ruler. A priestess who led a ceremony may not necessarily have controlled the palace administration or the wider kingdom. Without readable historical records, there is no final proof that Crete was governed by queens or that women held all formal authority. Still, the images cannot be ignored. They strongly suggest that women occupied respected and highly visible positions in Minoan religious and ceremonial life. They may have served as priestesses, officials, members of ruling families, guardians of sacred places, or representatives of powerful goddesses. Whatever the structure of Minoan government, their understanding of the divine seems to have been shaped largely through female forms. The snake goddess remains the most memorable face of this lost spiritual world. Her wide eyes still look forward after thousands of years. The snakes remain raised in her hands. The small animal continues to rest above her. She reminds us that ancient people did not always imagine sacred power in the same way. For the Minoans, the divine may have been connected to fertility, animals, mountains, caves, and the renewing strength of the earth. It may have appeared most clearly in the form of a woman. This created a striking contrast with many of the later religions of Greece and the Near East, where male gods, kings, warriors, and fathers often dominated the sacred order. If the snake represented the hidden chthonic power of the earth, then another animal represented something more visible and forceful. The bull. The bull was the embodiment of physical strength, danger, fertility, and untamed natural energy. It was one of the greatest animals in the Minoan imagination. Its image appeared across Crete. Bulls were carved into tiny seal stones. They were painted onto pottery. They appeared in frescoes and reliefs. Their heads were shaped into ceremonial vessels known as rita, which may have been used to pour wine, blood, water, or other offerings during religious rituals. The animal's power could be felt in nearly every form of Minoan art. Perhaps the most common symbol connected with the bull was the horns of consecration. These were stylized representations of a pair of bull's horns. They were carved from stone or built into architectural spaces. Examples were placed on palace roofs, beside shrines, around courts, and near important ritual areas. Their presence marked a place as sacred. A visitor approaching such a space would immediately recognize the symbol. The horns may have represented the animal itself, but they may also have suggested divine presence, protection, fertility, or the boundary between the ordinary and sacred worlds. The bull was clearly far more than a useful farm animal. It stood near the center of Minoan religious imagination. The great central courts of the palaces may have provided the main stage for the bull's ceremonial role. At Knossos, the broad court was surrounded by high walls, painted rooms, stairways, and balconies. During a major festival, spectators may have gathered on several levels. Important families, priests, priestesses, officials, and visitors could have watched from above, while performers and animals entered the open space below. Music may have echoed between the walls. The sound of drums, pipes, or chanting could have mixed with the movement of the crowd. Then the bull may have been brought into the court. The most famous image connected with such a ceremony is the bull leaping fresco from Knossos. It offers the clearest surviving picture of what this mysterious performance may have looked like. The fresco is a masterpiece of movement. A massive bull charges across the scene. Its body is stretched forward in what artists call a flying gallop. All four legs are shown away from the ground, creating the impression of great speed. The head is lowered. The horns point outward. The body of the animal fills most of the painted space. Around it are three slender athletes with long, dark hair. Their bodies appear graceful and carefully trained. At the front of the bull stands a pale-skinned figure. According to Minoan artistic convention, the light skin suggests that this figure is female. She reaches toward the animal's horns. Her position may show the beginning of the performance, perhaps as she prepares to catch, guide, or respond to the bull's movement. Above the center of the animal is a reddish-brown male athlete. His body curves through the air. He appears to be completing a backward leap over the bull's spine. His hands do not touch the animal. His legs extend behind him as he turns through the most dangerous moment of the movement. At the rear stands another pale-skinned female figure. Her arms are raised and extended toward the athlete. She may be waiting to catch or steady him as he lands. The three figures appear to work together. The image suggests coordination rather than individual competition. One performer meets the bull. Another moves across its back. The third prepares for the landing. For more than a century, scholars, athletes, and historians have debated what this fresco truly represents. Could the event have been performed exactly as it appears? Some modern acrobats and people experienced with bulls have argued that the movement would have been nearly impossible. A fully grown charging bull is powerful and unpredictable. If a performer grabbed its horns, the animal's natural reaction might be to throw its head upward. The athlete could be struck, tossed into the air, or badly injured. The horns themselves would make the position extremely dangerous. For this reason, many researchers doubt that the fresco records one literal moment. The image may instead combine several stages of the performance. Ancient artists did not always separate actions into individual scenes. The three figures may represent the same athlete or different athletes at the beginning, middle, and end of the leap. In this interpretation, the fresco functions almost like a sequence. First, the performer approaches the bull. Then the leap takes place. Finally, the athlete lands behind the animal. Another possibility is that the performers did not move directly over the bull from front to back. They may have approached from the side. By using the speed and movement of the animal, an athlete might have vaulted diagonally across its body, rather than turning over the horns and spine exactly as shown. Some historians have suggested that younger or specially trained bulls may have been used. The animals might have been selected for a calmer temperament or raised in controlled conditions. The performers themselves may have begun training while very young, developing strength, balance, timing, and familiarity with the animals. There is also the possibility that the entire scene is symbolic. Perhaps it represents a mythical event rather than an ordinary performance. The athlete's movement over the bull may have expressed a religious idea. It could symbolize human contact with divine power, the control of wild nature, the passage into adulthood, or the renewal of life. The fresco may show an idealized ceremony that could never have been performed exactly as painted. The truth remains uncertain. No written Minoan explanation has survived. We do not know what the ceremony was called. We do not know who was allowed to participate or how often it took place. We do not know whether the athletes were members of the elite, religious specialists, trained performers, prisoners, or young people completing a sacred initiation. Yet, whatever form the ritual took, it was clearly important. It brought human beings close to one of the strongest and most dangerous animals on Crete. It required discipline, confidence, and courage. The athletes had to understand movement, timing, and the behavior of the bull. A single mistake could have caused serious injury or death. Bull leaping therefore appears to have been more than entertainment. It was a sacred encounter. It joined danger with beauty and physical strength, with graceful movement. Before the watching crowds, human beings and animals entered a carefully arranged performance that stood somewhere between ceremony, sport, and prayer. It was one of the clearest expressions of the Minoan belief that natural power should not simply be destroyed. Instead, it could be approached, respected, and transformed into ritual. The athlete did not defeat the bull with a weapon. The athlete moved beside it, rose above it, and returned safely to the ground. For a brief moment, human skill and untamed nature seemed to become part of the same flowing motion. The danger faced by the bull leapers must have been immense. A performer could be struck by the horns, thrown beneath the animal's body, or crushed under its hooves. Even with careful training, perfect timing, and years of experience, the risk of serious injury or death could never have been completely removed. And it is here, in the sight of young men and women facing a powerful bull within the confusing corridors and open courts of the palace, that we may find the clearest historical foundation for the later legend of the Minotaur. The Greek myth told of 14 young Athenians sent to Crete and sacrificed to a bull-headed creature hidden inside a great maze. Perhaps this story preserved a distant and distorted memory of the real ceremonies performed at the Minoan palaces. Visitors from the Greek mainland may have heard of young athletes taking part in dangerous rituals involving bulls. They may have seen the enormous palace at Knossos, with its twisting corridors, hidden chambers, multiple staircases, and unfamiliar customs. Over generations, the details could have changed. The palace became a labyrinth. The sacred bull became a monster. The trained athletes became helpless victims. A difficult and mysterious ceremony became a story of sacrifice and death. The original meaning of bull leaping may remain unknown forever. Yet the art inspired by the ritual still tells us something important about the people who practiced it. The Minoans did not appear to hide from the dangerous forces of the natural world. They approached them. They did not attempt to overcome the bull through weapons or brute strength. Instead, they met its power with balance, discipline, speed, and grace. The animal remained wild and dangerous. The athlete survived by moving with it. For the Minoans, the bull may have represented the greatest possible test of courage and control. In this sacred encounter, human skill was placed beside the overwhelming strength of nature. The result was a ritual filled with beauty, risk, and uncertainty. For a brief moment, the athlete rose above the charging animal. Then, with luck and perfect timing, the performer returned safely to the ground. It was a dance near the edge of death, but it was also a celebration of life, movement, and the fearless spirit of Minoan culture. We have now wandered through their open palaces. We have seen their colorful frescoes, delicate pottery, mysterious goddesses, and dangerous ceremonies. Yet one important question remains. What made all of this possible? What was the source of the wealth and security that allowed such a refined and apparently stable civilization to flourish for centuries? Crete possessed fertile valleys, productive vineyards, olive groves, forests, and mountain pastures. Its farmers could grow grain, raise animals, press olive oil, and produce wine. But the true foundation of Minoan power was not found only in the land. It stretched across the blue water surrounding the island. Above all else, the Minoans were people of the sea. To understand their civilization, we must understand the idea of a thalassocracy. The word comes from the Greek thalassa, meaning sea, and kratos, meaning power or rule. A thalassocracy is a state whose wealth, security, and influence depend upon control of the sea. The Minoans created the first great maritime power in European history. Their influence did not spread along roads or across wide continental plains. It traveled across the water on the decks of their ships. We can form an idea of these vessels from frescoes, engraved seal stones, pottery designs, and small clay models. They were long and elegant, often shaped like narrow crescents. Their hulls curved upward at the bow and stern. A single mast carried a square sail that caught the Mediterranean wind. When the wind weakened, or when greater control was needed, teams of rowers powered the vessel through the water. The combination of sail and oars made the ships fast and maneuverable. They could move between islands, enter small harbors, and navigate the sometimes unpredictable waters of the Aegean Sea. The sailors who guided them needed deep, practical knowledge. They had to understand winds, currents, coastlines, stars, and seasonal changes. Before modern maps or navigational instruments, a captain relied on memory and experience. Mountains visible in the distance could guide a ship from one island to another. The rising and setting of the sun helped mark direction. At night, familiar stars appeared above the dark water. Crews also needed to recognize dangerous reefs, sudden storms, and the hidden rocks around unfamiliar shores. These ships became the instruments of a broad and profitable trading network. From harbors along the Cretan coast, they sailed outward, carrying the finest products of Minoan workshops and farms. Among the most valued exports was Kamares ware. These delicate vessels, with their thin walls and bright patterns painted against dark backgrounds, were admired far beyond Crete. Examples have been discovered in Egypt, the Levant, and other parts of the eastern Mediterranean. To own such pottery may have been a sign of wealth and refined taste. Minoan merchants also carried textiles. Although most ancient cloth has disappeared, the elaborate clothing shown in frescoes suggests that Minoan weavers produced finely made fabrics with complex colors and patterns. Wool and linen could be spun, dyed, woven, and traded across the sea. Metal workers produced bronze tools, weapons, vessels, and decorative objects. Jewelry and carved stone goods also traveled with merchants. Yet some of the most important cargoes were produced by the Cretan countryside. Large quantities of olive oil and wine were stored in tall clay containers. The jars were sealed and loaded onto ships for transportation. Olive oil was especially valuable. It could be used for cooking, lighting, medicine, religious offerings, perfume, and the care of the body. Wine was also important for daily life, trade, feasting, and ceremony. These goods connected the farms and villages of Crete to distant ports. A harvest gathered beneath the Cretan sun might eventually reach a household, palace, or temple far across the Mediterranean. In exchange, Minoan ships brought home materials that Crete could not easily provide. The most essential were copper and tin. When combined, these two metals produced bronze. Bronze was the defining material of the age. It could be shaped into knives, axes, swords, tools, armor, vessels, and ceremonial objects. Copper came in large quantities from Cyprus, an island so closely associated with the metal that its later name may have influenced the word copper itself. Tin was rarer. Some of it may have reached the Aegean through Anatolia, and wider trade routes extending far beyond the eastern Mediterranean. The exact source of every shipment is difficult to determine, but Minoan merchants were connected to networks that crossed great distances. From Egypt and the Near East came gold, ivory, and valuable stones. Lapis lazuli, with its deep blue color, had traveled across even longer routes from regions far to the east before reaching Mediterranean craftsmen. Elephant ivory could be carved into delicate figures, handles, boxes, and decorative pieces. Gold could be hammered into thin sheets, shaped into jewelry, or used to decorate sacred objects. Minoan artisans transformed these imported materials into works of great beauty. Trade, therefore, did more than make Crete wealthy. It supplied the raw materials that allowed Minoan craftsmanship to flourish. It also carried foreign ideas back to the island. Sailors, merchants, and officials encountered different languages, religions, styles of dress, artistic techniques, and systems of administration. These influences did not simply replace local traditions. The Minoans absorbed them and reshaped them into something distinctly their own. Among all their foreign connections, perhaps the most important was their relationship with ancient Egypt. Egypt was one of the richest and most powerful kingdoms in the Bronze Age world. Its rulers controlled the fertile Nile Valley, commanded large armies, and built temples and monuments on a scale unmatched by most neighboring peoples. Evidence of contact between Egypt and Crete appears in both lands. Minoan pottery has been discovered at Egyptian sites. Egyptian objects and artistic influences have been found on Crete. But some of the most remarkable evidence survives in paintings from Egyptian tombs. In the tombs of powerful officials at Thebes, foreign delegations are shown arriving with valuable goods. One of the best-known examples appears in the tomb of Rekhmire, a high-ranking vizier who served the Egyptian pharaoh during the 15th century before the Common Era. The wall paintings depict groups of foreign visitors approaching the Egyptian court. Hieroglyphic labels identify some of these people as the Keftiu. Many scholars believe this was the Egyptian name for people from Crete, or the wider Minoan world. The visitors have long, dark, curling hair. They wear decorated kilts similar to those shown in Minoan frescoes. Their narrow waists, clothing, and hairstyles make them immediately recognizable. They carry valuable objects as gifts or tribute for the pharaoh. Among these items are metal vessels with graceful handles, long-necked pottery, ornate containers, and drinking cups shaped like the heads of bulls. The objects closely resemble works produced by Minoan craftsmen. These Egyptian paintings are especially important because they provide evidence from outside Crete. They confirm that the Minoans were not an isolated island, people known only through their own ruins. They were recognized within the wider international world of the Eastern Mediterranean. Their representatives appeared at the court of one of the most powerful rulers on earth. Their finest goods were considered suitable gifts for the pharaoh. The scenes suggest diplomacy, trade, and mutual recognition between distant courts. A Minoan delegation traveling to Egypt would have made a long journey. Their ships would have sailed south from Crete, crossing hundreds of miles of open water before reaching the Nile Delta. From there, the travelers and their goods may have continued inland along the river. They would have entered a landscape unlike their island home. Instead of rocky coasts and mountain ridges, they saw the broad green valley of the Nile bordered by desert. They passed temples, towns, fields, and enormous monuments. Eventually, they arrived before Egyptian officials, carrying the wealth and artistry of Crete with them. Minoan influence was not limited to distant trading missions. Across the Aegean, communities developed close cultural and economic connections with Crete. Some may have functioned as colonies, settlements, trading stations, or independent towns strongly influenced by Minoan customs. The most famous example was Crete on the island of Thera, now known as Santorini. Crete was a prosperous Bronze Age town with narrow streets and buildings that rose several stories high. Its houses contained storage rooms, workshops, staircases, and advanced drainage systems. Many of its walls were covered in beautiful frescoes. The paintings showed ships, landscapes, animals, flowers, religious ceremonies, and scenes of everyday life. The town shared many features with the palaces and settlements of Crete. Its pottery, architecture, art, and administration reveal close connections with the Minoan world. Yet Crete was not merely a smaller copy of Knossos. It had its own local traditions and identity. It stood at an important point along the sea routes of the Aegean, where ships could stop, exchange goods, obtain supplies, and continue toward other islands or the Greek mainland. Other important centers on islands such as Rhodes, Cythera, and Melos also became connected with Minoan trade. These places helped form a network stretching across the sea. One harbor linked to the next. A ship leaving Crete did not need to cross the entire Aegean in a single journey. It could travel from island to island, following familiar routes. At each stop, merchants exchanged cargo, gathered information, repaired their vessels, and waited for favorable winds. Through this network, Minoan objects and artistic styles spread across a wide region. Local elites adopted Minoan pottery, clothing, seals, and religious symbols. Craftsmen imitated Cretan designs. Some communities may have used Minoan systems of writing and administration. Minoan culture became a language of prestige shared across the islands. This maritime network provides the clearest explanation for the Minoan world without walls. Their thalassocracy was the source of their prosperity. It protected the flow of goods. It connected Crete with allies, markets, and sources of raw materials. It allowed the palace centers to collect wealth and support large populations of artisans, priests, officials, sailors, and laborers. The navy was both their strongest weapon and their most reliable defense. A fleet could protect merchant ships from raiders. It could patrol important routes and respond to threats before hostile forces reached Crete. It could also carry Minoan power outward, ensuring that important harbors remained friendly and that trade continued to move. Later, Greek traditions referred to wooden walls when describing ships as the protection of a people. For the Minoans, this idea may have been especially true. Their strongest fortifications were not built from massive blocks of stone. They floated upon the sea. The wooden hulls of their vessels guarded the routes to Crete. As long as the fleet remained strong, the island's open palaces could continue to stand without enormous defensive walls. This mastery of the sea was the engine of Minoan civilization. It brought wealth into the storerooms of Knossos. It supplied artists with precious materials. It carried pottery and oil toward foreign markets. It allowed ideas and people to move between distant shores. It gave the Minoans a sense of confidence that shaped their art, architecture, and way of life. Yet the same system that made them powerful also made them vulnerable. Their palaces depended on ships. Their workshops depended on imported materials. Their economy depended on open sea routes and stable trading partners. If those connections were ever broken, the consequences could spread quickly through the entire civilization. The sea that protected and enriched the Minoans could also carry danger, and the islands that formed their maritime world were shaped by powerful natural forces hidden deep beneath the earth. While the discovery of the great palace and its colorful treasures captured the imagination of the public, Arthur Evans remained fascinated by objects that were much smaller. To him, some of the most important discoveries were not thrones, frescoes, or enormous storage jars. They were simple pieces of clay marked with carefully arranged symbols. We must remember that Evans had not originally come to Crete in search of the labyrinth. His journey began with a mystery of language. He had followed the strange signs carved into the small seal stones sold in the markets of Athens. Those symbols had led him to Knossos. And now, beneath the palace floors and among the remains of storerooms and offices, he was finally beginning to uncover the lost writing system he had hoped to find. Among the burned ruins of Knossos, Arthur Evans finally discovered what he had originally come to Crete to find. His hopes were fulfilled far beyond anything he could have imagined. Inside several small chambers, the excavation team uncovered the remains of the palace archives. There were hundreds of flat clay tablets, many of them shaped like small pillows or narrow leaves. Some survived almost complete, while others had broken into scattered fragments. The tablets had originally been made from soft, sun-dried clay. They were not created to last forever. Once the information written upon them was no longer needed, the clay could probably be softened, smoothed, and used again. Yet the destruction of the palace changed their fate. When fire swept through the building, the heat accidentally baked the tablets until they became hard. The same flames that brought an end to the palace preserved its records for thousands of years. These were not great histories of famous kings. They were not poems about gods, heroes, or battles. Instead, the tablets contained the ordinary paperwork of palace administration. They recorded the quiet, practical details that allowed a complex society to function. There were inventories of olive oil and wine. There were lists of sheep, goats, cattle, grain, textiles, vessels, and other valuable goods. Some tablets recorded palace workers and the duties they performed. Others contained information about land, workshops, chariots, weapons, or offerings presented to divine beings whose identities remain uncertain. At first glance, these lists might seem less exciting than a painted throne room or a golden object. yet they revealed something equally important. The palace at Knossos was supported by a highly organized bureaucracy. Scribes followed the movement of goods through storerooms and workshops. They counted animals. They recorded deliveries from farms and villages. They noted what was distributed to workers, officials, sanctuaries, and religious ceremonies. The palace depended upon memory made permanent in clay. The writing itself combined several different elements. There were carefully drawn linear signs, many of which represented spoken syllables. There were also simple pictograms showing recognizable objects, such as a chariot, a vessel, an animal, or a stalk of grain. Beside them appeared a clear numerical system used to record quantities. A trained palace scribe could look at a tablet and understand not only the words, but also the numbers and commodities being counted. Evans began the long task of studying the tablets. He examined the signs, arranged the fragments, and compared one group with another. Gradually, he realized that the palace had used two distinct but related writing systems. The older script appeared more flowing and varied. Evans believed, correctly, that it represented the native language of Minoan civilization. He named it Linear A. The second script looked somewhat more regular and rigid. It appeared mainly in the final period of the palace at Knossos, shortly before its last destruction. Evans called this system Linear B. The names were simple. They did not reveal what the scripts meant. For approximately 50 years, both systems remained silent. Scholars could see the individual signs. They could count them and compare their shapes. They could identify repeated patterns. Yet they could not turn those marks into understandable language. The tablets seemed to offer the voices of a lost world, but no one knew how to listen. The mystery of Linear B was eventually solved by someone working outside the traditional world of ancient history. His name was Michael Ventris. Ventris was an English architect with an extraordinary gift for languages and patterns. He had first become fascinated by the undeciphered scripts while still a schoolboy. The mystery remained with him as he grew older. During the Second World War, he gained experience with codes and structured systems of information. After the war, he returned to Linear B with patience and determination. He did not possess a magical key. Instead, he approached the script through careful comparison. Ventris cataloged the signs. He studied how often each one appeared. He examined which symbols occurred at the beginnings or endings of words. He looked for repeated groups and tried to identify possible grammatical patterns. He also compared tablets from different archaeological sites. Certain groups of symbols appeared more frequently in particular locations. Ventris began to wonder whether some of these repeated groups represented place names. This possibility offered an important path forward. A place name could survive even when political systems, rulers, and languages changed. By the early 1950s, Ventris was cautiously testing an idea that many scholars had rejected. Perhaps Linear B recorded an early form of Greek. At the time, this seemed unlikely. Many researchers believed that Greek-speaking people had arrived too late to have used the script found in Bronze Age palace archives. Ventris himself had not originally expected the language to be Greek. But as he assigned possible sound values to the signs and compared them with familiar Cretan place names, something remarkable happened. The symbols began to form recognizable words. In 1952, Ventris announced his breakthrough. Linear B could be read as an early form of Greek. The decipherment was confirmed through further study, especially through his collaboration with the classical scholar John Chadwick. Words for people, animals, goods, places, and gods began to emerge from the tablets. The silent lists could finally be understood. The discovery transformed the study of the Bronze Age. It proved that Greek was being written centuries earlier than previously known. It also revealed that the final administrators of Knossos were not speakers of the original Minoan language. They were Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. At some point during the later history of the palace, Mycenaean rulers had taken control of Knossos, or gained authority over its administration. Their scribes continued to use many features of the earlier palace system. They counted goods, managed workers, organized offerings, and recorded information on clay. But they adapted the writing system to record their own Greek language. Linear B therefore preserved the voice of the Mycenaean world. Its tablets contain early forms of names that would later appear in Greek mythology and religion. Gods such as Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, and Dionysus can be recognized among the records. Yet the tablets are not epic stories about these divine figures. They are administrative notes, recording offerings of grain, oil, animals, or other goods. The great gods of later Greece first appear not in poetry, but in accounts kept by palace scribes. The decipherment of Linear B solved one enormous mystery. At the same time, however, it made another mystery even clearer. Linear A was not Greek. The older script used many signs that resembled those of Linear B, but the language beneath them was different. It was the true written language of the Minoans, and that language remains unreadable. Researchers have identified many of the signs and can sometimes estimate how they might have sounded. They can recognize numbers, repeated formulas, and possible names. But knowing the sound of a word does not reveal its meaning when the underlying language is unknown. Linear A may preserve inventories, offerings, titles, prayers, and personal names. It may contain words once spoken in palace courts, workshops, shrines, and mountain sanctuaries. Yet no long bilingual inscription has been found to provide a reliable translation. There is no Minoan equivalent of the Rosetta Stone. To this day, Linear A remains one of the great undeciphered writing systems of the ancient world. Another mysterious object deepens this sense of silence. It was discovered at the palace of Phaistos in southern Crete. The object is known as the Phaistos disk. It is a circular piece of fired clay approximately 6 inches across. Both sides are covered with symbols arranged in a spiral. There are 45 different signs in total, repeated in various combinations. Some resemble people. Others appear to show animals, plants, tools, weapons, or unfamiliar objects. What makes the disk especially unusual is the way the symbols were created. They were not individually drawn by hand. Instead, each image appears to have been pressed into the soft clay with a prepared stamp. The maker used separate stamps for the different symbols, placing them one after another before the clay was fired. For this reason, the Phaistos disk is sometimes described as an early form of movable printing. The same symbols could be repeated quickly and consistently. Nothing quite like it has been found elsewhere in the Minoan world. Its purpose remains unknown. It may contain a prayer. Perhaps it records a hymn, a ritual, a game, a calendar, or a list. It could even have been brought to Crete from somewhere else. Its language is uncertain, and its symbols have never been convincingly deciphered. Because the disk is unique, there are too few examples for scholars to compare. the spiral of signs continues toward the center, inviting the eye to follow it. But wherever the message leads, its meaning remains closed. And so, despite all the discoveries at Knossos, a deep silence remains. Thanks to Michael Ventris, we can read the final administrative records written by Mycenaean scribes. We can learn how many sheep were counted, which goods entered a storeroom, and what offerings were prepared for certain gods. But we still cannot hear the original Minoan language. We do not know what the people of Crete called their rulers. We do not know the true names of the female figures shown in their religious art. We do not even know what they called themselves. The modern name Minoan was created by Arthur Evans, inspired by the legendary King Minos. The people who built Knossos may have used an entirely different name. That name may be written somewhere on a clay tablet. For now, however, it remains hidden. The Minoans are a civilization we can see with extraordinary clarity. We can walk through their rooms. We can admire their paintings, pottery, jewelry, and ships. We can examine the food they stored and the objects they offered to their gods. Yet their own words remain just beyond our understanding. During the final prosperous decades of the 17th century before the Common Era, the Minoan world stood close to the height of its power. The palaces were flourishing centers of art, craft, ceremony, and administration. Trading ships crossed the Aegean Sea. Minoan goods reached Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, and the Greek mainland. Their influence could be seen in distant settlements and island towns. To those living within this prosperous world, its foundations may have seemed secure. The sea routes were open, the workshops were active, the storerooms were full. The palaces had been rebuilt and enlarged across generations. It may have been difficult to imagine that this brilliant system could ever be seriously threatened. Yet the greatest danger did not come from a rival kingdom or an approaching fleet. It was forming quietly beneath an island approximately 70 miles north of Crete. That island was Thera, known today as Santorini. Thera was one of the brightest centers in the Minoan trading network. Its position in the southern Aegean made it an ideal stopping point for ships traveling between Crete, the Cycladic Islands, and the Greek mainland. On its shore stood the prosperous settlement of Akrotiri. Akrotiri was a town of merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and wealthy families. Its streets passed between buildings that rose 2 or 3 stories high. Some houses contained elegant furniture, storage rooms, staircases, bathrooms, and drainage systems. Their walls were painted with magnificent frescoes. There were scenes of ships moving between coastal settlements. There were landscapes filled with flowers, rocks, birds, and animals. Young people appeared in ceremonies. Women wore fine clothing and jewelry. The paintings reveal a community closely connected to the wider Minoan world, yet rich in its own local traditions. Akrotiri must have been filled with movement. Goods arrived at the harbor. Jars of oil and wine were carried through the streets. Fishermen returned from the sea. Craftsmen worked inside their rooms, while merchants prepared cargo for the next voyage. From the upper windows, residents could look across the water toward neighboring islands. The island itself appeared beautiful. Its cliffs rose above the Aegean, surrounded by deep blue water. Yet beneath that landscape lay an enormous volcano. For generations, the people of Thera had lived inside and around an ancient volcanic system. The earth beneath them was not still. Magma moved slowly below the island, gathering pressure in hidden chambers. The first clear warning of the approaching disaster may have come through a series of earthquakes. The ground began to tremble. Walls cracked. Objects fell from shelves. Heavy storage jars tipped onto the floor. Furniture shifted, and stone blocks loosened from buildings. The people of Akrotiri understood that they were in danger. Archaeological evidence suggests that the town was evacuated before the final eruption. Beds were left overturned. Broken pottery remained on the floors. Some buildings appear to have been cleared or repaired after an earlier earthquake, suggesting that residents may briefly have returned. Yet no human bodies have been discovered within the buried town. This absence is remarkable. It suggests that the inhabitants recognized the warnings and escaped before the greatest destruction arrived. Perhaps they gathered their children and carried away whatever valuables they could manage. Perhaps officials organized the evacuation. Families may have moved toward boats in the harbor or traveled to safer parts of the island. They left behind large furniture, heavy jars, tools, wall paintings, and many ordinary possessions. They may have believed that they would soon return. They could not have known that their homes were about to disappear beneath volcanic ash. Nor could they have imagined the full scale of the forces gathering beneath the ground. The earthquakes had given them time to flee the city, but they were only the beginning. The island of Thera was approaching one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in the history of the ancient Mediterranean. And when the volcano finally awakened, its effects would reach far beyond Akrotiri. The disaster would spread across the sea and shake the foundations of the entire Minoan world. When the eruption finally came, it was one of the most powerful volcanic events in human history. The force released by Thera was many times greater than the famous eruption of Krakatoa. A tremendous explosion tore through the island. The sound must have traveled across the Aegean Sea, rolling over distant islands and coastlines like thunder that would not end. The mountain did not simply erupt. It began to destroy itself. A vast column of ash, pumice, rock, and superheated gas rose high into the atmosphere. It climbed more than 20 miles above the earth, spreading outward into an enormous cloud that covered the sky. Sunlight faded. Across the Aegean, the clear blue sky may first have turned yellow, then brown, and finally a heavy gray. Day became dim and unfamiliar. For those living beneath the cloud, it may have seemed as though evening had arrived in the middle of the day. The air filled with ash. Fine particles settled onto roofs, fields, streets, and ships. Breathing became difficult. The sun appeared only as a pale circle behind the haze. On Thera itself, the town of Akrotiri disappeared quickly. Pumice began to fall from the sky. At first, the pieces may have been light and scattered. Then the fall became heavier. Ash and volcanic stone covered the streets, entered houses, and gathered against walls. Roofs collapsed beneath the growing weight. Doors, windows, furniture, pottery, and painted rooms were sealed beneath thick layers of debris. The town was entombed. Its buildings disappeared from view, preserved within the volcanic material. Like the later Roman city of Pompeii, Akrotiri became a settlement frozen in time. Its people had gone, but their rooms remained. The frescoes survived on the walls. Storage jars remained where they had been placed. Tools, beds, vessels, and staircases rested beneath the ash, waiting to be uncovered thousands of years later. Yet the burial of Akrotiri was not the final stage of the disaster. Far below the surface, the volcano's magma chamber had been emptied by the eruption. Without enough material to support the land above, the central part of the island began to collapse. A vast section of Thera fell inward. The sea rushed into the empty space. This collapse helped to create the enormous volcanic basin, or caldera, that forms the center of Santorini today. The modern island's curved cliffs preserve the outline of this ancient destruction. The sudden collapse displaced an immense volume of water. From the broken island, waves began to travel outward in every direction. These were not ordinary waves created by wind. They were tsunamis. Long, powerful surges moved across the sea at extraordinary speed. In deep water, they may not have appeared especially high, but as they approached the shallower coastal waters around neighboring islands, they slowed and rose. The water gathered into immense walls. Crete lay only about 70 miles to the south. Along its northern coast, the Minoans may first have noticed strange signs. The sky was already darkened by ash. A distant roar had come from the direction of Thera. The ground may have trembled. Then the sea began to behave in a way no one could understand. The water pulled away from the shore. Harbors emptied. Boats settled onto the exposed seabed. Fish were left moving helplessly among wet stones. Areas normally hidden beneath the waves appeared under the gray light. For a brief moment, the coastline may have become unnaturally quiet. People could have walked forward in confusion. Some may have remained near the harbor, watching the water retreat farther into the distance. Others may have understood that something dangerous was approaching and tried to reach higher ground. Then the sea returned. A vast wave moved toward the coast. It struck the northern shores of Crete with overwhelming force. Harbors, villages, workshops, villas, and warehouses stood directly in its path. Many of these settlements had no defensive walls. Even if they had possessed them, stone fortifications would have offered little protection against such a mass of water. The wave swept inland. Buildings collapsed. Walls were broken apart. Heavy objects were lifted and carried away. Mud, stone, timber, pottery, boats, animals, and seawater moved together through the coastal settlements. The great Minoan fleet may have suffered its most terrible loss inside the very harbors that were meant to protect it. Ships at anchor could not escape. Some vessels were thrown against the shore. Others struck one another or broke apart against harbor structures. Their wooden hulls splintered beneath the force of the water. Ships that had once crossed the Aegean and carried the wealth of Crete toward Egypt and the Near East were reduced to broken timber. In only a short time, the wooden walls of the Minoan world may have been shattered. The first tsunami was probably not the only one. Volcanic collapses and repeated movements of water could have produced several waves. After each surge, the sea withdrew and then returned again. People who survived the first impact may have remained in danger for hours. When the water finally receded, the northern coastline had been transformed. Harbors were filled with wreckage. Fields were covered in salt water and mud. Fishing boats had vanished. Homes and workshops lay broken. The routes connecting Crete to the wider Mediterranean world had been severely damaged. Yet destruction by water was only one part of the disaster. The atmosphere remained filled with volcanic material. Ash drifted southward and settled over parts of Crete. Across the eastern side of the island, fine white dust fell slowly from the sky. It may have resembled snow, but it carried no coolness or purity. It gathered on leaves and branches. It covered the soil. It entered wells, streams, and storage containers. When mixed with water, it formed a heavy paste. Crops struggled beneath the ash. Plants could not receive enough sunlight. Grazing land was contaminated, and animals may have become sick after eating ash-covered grass or drinking polluted water. The Minoan economy depended on agriculture. Olive trees, grapevines, grain fields, herds, and orchards supplied food for local communities and products for overseas trade. If harvests failed, the effects would spread through every level of society. Farmers would have little to deliver to the palace. Storerooms would begin to empty. Workers who depended on palace rations might receive less food. Wine and olive oil could no longer be exported in the same quantities. The disaster therefore reached far beyond the coast. It entered kitchens, farms, workshops, and palace records. The Minoans had not been defeated by an enemy fleet. No foreign army had crossed the sea and broken through their defenses. Instead, their world had been struck by forces rising from deep within the earth. The land beneath Thera had opened. The sky had darkened. The sea that had always protected and enriched Crete had turned violently against it. Their ships had been destroyed. Their trade routes were disrupted. Their fields and water supplies had been threatened. The confidence that had shaped Minoan life must have been deeply shaken. For generations, the sea had seemed to offer safety. Now it had carried destruction directly into their towns. For generations, the earth had provided grain, fruit, oil, and wine. Now ash covered the soil. The long, prosperous summer of Minoan civilization was beginning to end. The question was no longer how the palaces would grow richer or how far their ships would travel. The question was how the people of Crete could continue at all. In the immediate aftermath of the eruption, the Minoan world was permanently altered. The northern coast bore the scars of the tsunamis. Eastern Crete lay beneath a pale covering of ash and pumice. Ports that once received ships from across the Aegean had become fields of debris. For many years, historians believed that this disaster brought Minoan civilization to an immediate end. The explanation seemed simple and dramatic. Thera erupted. The tsunamis struck Crete. The Minoan world disappeared. It was an attractive story because it gave one clear cause and one sudden ending. A powerful civilization was destroyed in a single catastrophic moment. But archaeology rarely offers such simple conclusions. As researchers excavated more sites and studied the layers of destruction more carefully, a different picture emerged. The eruption was devastating. But it did not erase Minoan civilization in one season. It marked the beginning of a much slower decline. The end was not a sudden death. It was a long twilight. At coastal sites such as Palai in eastern Crete, the evidence for the disaster is unmistakable. Archaeologists found layers of volcanic ash and pumice. Among them lay the confused remains of destroyed buildings. Stones, pottery, soil, and broken objects had been mixed together by powerful water. Some materials had been carried far inland. The arrangement of the debris revealed the force of a great wave moving across the landscape. These discoveries confirmed that tsunamis reached Crete. They also showed that certain coastal communities suffered enormous damage. Homes were destroyed. Harbors were ruined. Ships and cargoes disappeared. Families who depended on fishing and maritime trade may have lost everything. The ashfall created another crisis. In eastern Crete, thick volcanic deposits may have reduced agricultural production for several years. Fields could have been difficult to cultivate. Animals may have lacked clean grazing land. Fresh water became harder to find. A series of poor harvests could easily have led to hunger. Food shortages may have forced people to leave damaged settlements and seek safety elsewhere. Palace authorities may have attempted to redistribute stored grain and oil. But even large storerooms could not support entire regions indefinitely. The effects may have continued long after the sky cleared. Yet this was not the experience of every part of Crete. At Knossos, in the central region of the island, archaeologists found no thick volcanic ash layer from the eruption. They also found no clear evidence that the palace was destroyed at that moment. Other important settlements in southern and western Crete showed the same pattern. They were not buried. Their walls did not collapse beneath the ash. Their buildings remained standing. The physical heart of Minoan civilization survived. People continued to live in the palaces and towns. Workshops reopened. Goods were stored. Religious ceremonies continued. Scribes may still have recorded supplies on clay tablets. The civilization endured, though in a wounded and increasingly uncertain form. The most dangerous damage was not always visible in the stone walls. It lay within the systems that had supported Minoan prosperity. The palaces depended on a complex network. Ships carried goods between islands. Ports connected Crete with Egypt, Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Levant. Imported copper and tin supplied the metalworkers. Foreign gold, ivory, and precious stones entered palace workshops. Cretan wine, pottery, textiles, and olive oil were exported in return. The eruption disrupted this entire structure. The destruction of the northern harbors was the first major blow. A port was more than a place where ships rested. It contained warehouses, docks, workshops, traders, sailors, records, and supplies. When a harbor disappeared, all of these connections disappeared with it. The loss of ships may have been even more serious. A vessel required timber, skilled labor, rope, cloth, tools, and experienced sailors. A great fleet could not be replaced quickly. Even if the palaces possessed enough wealth to build new ships, they may not have had enough trained crews to sail them. Sailors who died in the tsunamis took generations of knowledge with them. They had known the safest routes between islands. They understood the winds and currents. They recognized distant coastlines. Their experience could not simply be recreated from written instructions. Without the fleet, the Minoans could no longer protect trade as they once had. Merchants faced greater danger from pirates and rival powers. Imported materials became rarer and more expensive. Bronze production depended on copper and tin arriving from overseas. If those shipments slowed, workshops could not produce the same numbers of tools, weapons, and luxury objects. The loss of exports created another problem. Palaces had collected olive oil, wine, pottery, textiles, and crafted goods, partly because these products could be exchanged abroad. If foreign markets became unreachable, palace storerooms might fill with goods that could no longer be traded. At the same time, officials lost the foreign materials they needed. The economy that had supported Minoan art, administration, and architecture began to weaken. This damage may have been immediate, even in regions untouched by ash or waves. A palace could remain standing while the world around it slowly changed. Its walls might still be painted. Its storerooms might still contain jars. Its courts might still host ceremonies. Yet the ships were fewer. The harbors were quieter. The flow of goods had slowed. The foundations of Minoan prosperity had begun to break apart. The eruption of Thera did not end the civilization in a single day, but it damaged the system that had allowed it to flourish. And once that system was weakened, new dangers began to gather around the wounded island. The destruction of ships, harbors, and trade routes was only the first great wound left by the eruption of Thera. The second wound may have been less visible, but no less damaging. It was psychological and spiritual. Minoan religion appears to have been closely connected with the natural world. Their sacred places stood on mountain peaks and inside deep caves. Their artists painted flowers, birds, dolphins, bulls, monkeys, and flowing landscapes. Their ceremonies followed the rhythms of the earth, the sea, fertility, growth, death, and renewal. Nature was not simply the background of Minoan life. It was alive with sacred meaning. The land provided grain, grapes, olives, animals, and fresh water. The sea brought fish, trade, wealth, and contact with distant peoples. The sun warmed the fields and guided sailors across the Aegean. For generations, these forces may have seemed stable and generous. Then, without warning, the natural world changed. The earth shook beneath homes and palaces. The sun disappeared behind volcanic ash. Day became dark. The sea withdrew from the coast and returned as a wall of destruction. Fields were covered in pale dust. Harbors were broken apart. Ships vanished. To people living in the Bronze Age, such events could not be explained through geology, pressure beneath the earth, or the movement of volcanic material. They would have been understood through religion. The eruption may have seemed like a sign that the balance between humanity and the gods had been broken. Perhaps sacred ceremonies had failed. Perhaps an offering had been rejected. Perhaps the gods were angry. The destruction may have created a deep crisis of faith. Priests and priestesses held authority partly because they were believed to understand the divine world. They knew the correct rituals. They guarded sacred objects. They led processions and presented offerings. They climbed to mountain sanctuaries and entered caves where the powers of the earth were believed to dwell. Palace rulers may also have claimed a special relationship with the gods. Their position depended not only on wealth and administration, but on the belief that they helped preserve order. As long as crops grew, ships returned safely, and the palaces prospered, the religious system appeared to work. But after the eruption, people may have begun to question that system. If the gods favored the palace, why had the harbors been destroyed? If the priests could maintain harmony with nature, why had the earth shaken and the sky gone dark? If rulers were responsible for the safety of the community, why were the storerooms emptying and the trade routes failing? Such questions would have been dangerous. They could weaken obedience. They could encourage rival leaders. They could create conflict between towns, villages, and palace authorities. Religious uncertainty may have combined with hunger, economic decline, and the movement of displaced people. Families from damaged coastal regions may have traveled inland seeking food and shelter. Communities already facing shortages may have struggled to support them. The palace administrators may have demanded greater contributions from farmers at the very moment when harvests were failing. Workers who once received regular rations might have found those supplies reduced. Craftsmen could no longer obtain the imported materials needed for their work. Sailors, traders, and dock workers may have lost their livelihoods entirely. A civilization known for openness and confidence was slowly becoming uncertain. This weakening created an empty space within the Aegean world. For centuries, Minoan ships had controlled important routes between the islands. Their merchants traveled widely. Their artistic styles influenced distant communities. Their palaces stood at the center of a broad maritime network. But as the Minoan fleet diminished, another civilization was rising across the sea. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans were growing stronger. The Mycenaeans lived in fortified centers such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes. Their rulers built citadels on defensible hills. Their warriors carried swords, spears, shields, and bronze armor. Their art and burials reveal a society in which military strength, hunting, competition, and personal status played important roles. They were younger than the palace civilization of Crete. For generations, they had admired Minoan goods and adopted many elements of Minoan culture. But they were also ambitious. As Cretan control of the sea weakened, Mycenaean sailors gained new freedom. They could travel farther. They could establish new trading relationships. They could enter harbors once dominated by Minoan merchants. They could also raid vulnerable communities and seize valuable cargo. The balance of power began to shift gradually from Crete toward the Greek mainland. The eruption of Thera, therefore, did not instantly destroy Minoan civilization. It delivered a deep wound from which the island never completely recovered. The palaces remained active. Artists continued to work. Ceremonies were still performed. Ships continued to sail. But the scale and confidence of the earlier period were fading. For approximately another century and a half, Minoan culture endured in a reduced and changing form. The long twilight had begun. Trade was weaker. The population may have suffered from famine, disease, migration, and social disorder. Regional leaders may have become more independent as palace authority declined. The old networks of exchange became harder to maintain. The Minoan world still possessed beauty, knowledge, and skilled craftsmen, but it no longer held the same secure position within the Aegean. Its legendary confidence had been damaged. The civilization that once looked outward from open palaces and busy harbors had become increasingly vulnerable. Across the sea, the Mycenaeans watched and waited. Eventually, their influence reached Crete itself. By the later 15th century before the Common Era, many of the major Minoan palace centers had been destroyed. Knossos survived longer than most. But the evidence found within its final archives reveals a major change. The scribes were now using Linear B, and Linear B recorded Greek. Mycenaean rulers had taken control of the palace. The warriors from the mainland arrived as conquerors, yet they were also students and apprentices. They entered a civilization older and, in many ways, more sophisticated than their own. The Mycenaeans possessed strong fortresses, experienced warriors, and ambitious rulers. But the Minoans had developed complex systems of administration, maritime trade, architecture, painting, craftsmanship, plumbing, and religious ceremony over many centuries. The newcomers did not simply destroy everything they found. Instead, they absorbed much of it. They adopted Minoan techniques and reshaped them to suit their own society. They learned from Cretan scribes. They used palace records. They employed artists and craftsmen. They borrowed symbols, objects, architectural ideas, and religious practices. In this way, the Mycenaeans became an important bridge. Through them, parts of Minoan culture survived beyond the fall of the original palace civilization. Those traditions would later pass into the stories and beliefs of the Greek world. The clearest evidence of this cultural exchange appears in Mycenaean art and architecture. On the mainland, palaces at places such as Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycenae were decorated with frescoes. The technique had been refined in Crete. Artists applied color to wet plaster, allowing the image to become part of the wall itself. Mycenaean rulers admired this art and brought it into their own ceremonial halls. The painted walls gave their palaces color, dignity, and a sense of connection with the prestigious culture of Crete. But although the technique was Minoan, the subject matter changed. The artists now worked for a society with different priorities. At Knossos and other Minoan sites, frescoes had shown dolphins, flowers, processions, graceful figures, sacred animals, and scenes of ceremony. In Mycenaean palaces, the atmosphere became more martial. Warriors appeared in armor. Soldiers marched in processions. Chariots moved through military scenes. Men hunted dangerous animals. Boars were pursued through wild landscapes. Battles, sieges, weapons, and heroic strength became more visible. The graceful world of the Minoan palace was transformed by the concerns of a warrior elite. The contrast can be felt in the subjects chosen for the walls. At Knossos, dolphins moved gently through a painted sea. In Mycenaean art, armed men advanced toward the conflict. Minoan athletes interacted with bulls through movement and balance. Mycenaean hunters often confronted animals with spears and force. The technique remained elegant. The colors could still be vivid, but the emotional world had changed. This was the art of rulers who measured status partly through war, hunting, and military power. Mycenaean warriors were sometimes shown wearing heavy bronze armor. Some helmets were decorated with rows of curved boar tusks. Creating one of these helmets required the tusks of many animals, making it a sign of wealth, hunting skill, and elite status. A warrior wearing such equipment would have appeared imposing. His clothing announced that he belonged to a society organized around danger and competition. Yet Mycenaean kings and nobles clearly valued the superior skill of Minoan craftsmen. Fine objects produced in Crete, or created by Cretan artisans working on the mainland, were placed in wealthy graves and royal buildings. One of the most beautiful examples was discovered in a tomb at Vaphio in southern Greece. There, archaeologists found 2 gold cups. The vessels are small, but their surfaces are decorated with scenes of bulls and human activity in astonishing detail. The cups were made by hammering thin sheets of gold into complex raised images. Every animal, human figure, tree, net, and line of movement required careful planning. The craftsmanship is so refined that many scholars believe they were created by Minoan artists, or by craftsmen working directly within the Minoan tradition. Together, the 2 cups seem to show the meeting of the Minoan and Mycenaean worlds. On one vessel, the scene is violent. Bulls struggle against human hunters. One animal appears trapped. Another attacks a man and throws him through the air. The bodies twist across the gold surface in a scene filled with danger and confusion. The image emphasizes conflict between people and powerful animals. This subject would have appealed strongly to the warrior culture of the mainland. The second cup has a quieter mood. Here, bulls are not overcome through direct force. A decoy cow is used to draw the animals toward waiting men and nets. The capture appears more controlled. The people work through patience, skill, and an understanding of animal behavior. The scene suggests harmony and intelligence rather than a violent struggle. This gentler approach seems closer to the Minoan artistic tradition. One cup shows wild power met through force. The other shows nature approached through careful cooperation. Placed beside one another, they reveal two different ways of understanding the same animal. They also show how closely the two civilizations had become connected. The Mycenaeans borrowed more than artistic techniques. They also inherited parts of the Minoan religious world. Linear B tablets record the names of several gods familiar from later Greek mythology. Zeus appears. Poseidon appears. Hera and Dionysus are also present. These deities were already receiving offerings in the Bronze Age, centuries before the poems of Homer were written down. Yet, Mycenaean religion also included sacred traditions that had developed earlier on Crete. The horns of consecration began to appear in mainland shrines and artistic scenes. The double axe, or labris, was also adopted as a religious symbol. Minoan ritual objects, decorative patterns, and sacred animals continued to influence Mycenaean worship. The two religious systems blended. The Mycenaeans brought their own gods, traditions, and social structures. From Crete, they adopted symbols associated with bulls, goddesses, sacred places, and palace ceremony. Over time, the powerful female-centered imagery of the Minoan world began to fade. The Greek religious system that later emerged was more clearly patriarchal. Male gods ruled from the heights of Olympus. Zeus became the king of the gods. Poseidon ruled the sea. Apollo, Ares, Hermes, and other male deities occupied important places in myth and worship. Powerful goddesses survived as well. Hera, Athena, Artemis, Demeter, Aphrodite, and others remained essential to Greek religion. But the balance was different from the spiritual world suggested by the Minoan images. The snake goddess, the sacred priestesses, and the female figures commanding animals no longer stood so clearly at the center. Still, parts of that older faith endured. The symbols remained even when their original meanings were forgotten. Sacred bulls continued to appear in Greek stories. Goddesses remained connected with animals, fertility, mountains, and wild landscapes. Caves continued to serve as places of worship. The double axe survived in myth and ritual. Older Minoan beliefs became quiet echoes within the religion of the people who followed. Perhaps the most enduring Minoan legacy survived not in buildings or objects, but in stories. The later Greeks looked back toward the Bronze Age as a distant, heroic past. It was the age of great kings, dangerous voyages, divine intervention, sieges, monsters, and legendary warriors. Many of these stories were set during the Mycenaean period. Agamemnon ruled at Mycenae. Nestor lived at Pylos. Heroes sailed to Troy. Palaces were filled with bronze weapons, treasure, and ambitious rulers. But within these Greek legends, the memory of Crete also remained. It survived in distorted and dreamlike forms. The story of the labyrinth may preserve the Greek memory of the enormous palace at Knossos. To a visitor unfamiliar with its design, the building could seem impossibly confusing. Its corridors twisted between rooms and courtyards. Its staircases moved between several levels. Its doorways opened into unexpected chambers. It had grown across centuries until it became a complex world of its own. Later, storytellers transformed this palace into a maze from which no one could escape. At its center, they placed the Minotaur. The bull-headed monster may preserve the distant memory of Minoan bull worship and bull-leaping ceremonies. Young men and women facing the animal in a palace court became, in Greek legend, youths sent as sacrifices. A sacred ritual became a fearful punishment. The palace became a prison. The bull became a monster. The story of Daedalus may also reflect the extraordinary achievements of Minoan craftsmen. In Greek mythology, Daedalus was the greatest inventor of his age. He designed the labyrinth. He created moving objects. He understood architecture, engineering, and materials. His skill seemed almost supernatural. Perhaps this legendary craftsman represented the Greek memory of Minoan artisans. The people who built the palaces of Crete had created advanced drainage systems, light wells, grand staircases, multi-story buildings, delicate pottery, carved seals, metal vessels, and brilliant frescoes. To later Greeks, such achievements may have seemed like the work of one impossible genius. The name Daedalus became attached to the entire tradition of Minoan invention. King Minos may preserve another historical memory. In myth, he was the powerful ruler of Crete. His authority reached across the sea. He commanded ships, conquered enemies, and forced Athens to accept his rule. Later, Greek writers even described Minos as one of the earliest masters of the Aegean. Behind this legendary king may lie the memory of the Minoan thalassocracy. For centuries, Cretan ships had crossed the sea. Minoan merchants and officials had traveled between islands. Their goods reached Egypt and the Near East. Their settlements and artistic influence spread throughout the Aegean. Long after the political system disappeared, people remembered that Crete had once ruled the sea. They gave this memory a human face. They called him Minos. The Minoan civilization, therefore, did not vanish completely. Its palaces fell. Its language became unreadable. Its political authority disappeared. But its culture entered the world of the Mycenaeans. Minoan techniques survived in mainland art. Their administrative systems influenced palace government. Their religious symbols entered Greek worship. Their craftsmanship continued to inspire rulers and nobles. Their maritime power became the kingdom of Minos. Their architecture became the labyrinth. Their bull ceremonies became the story of the Minotaur. Their artists became Daedalus. The Mycenaeans carried these memories forward. They connected the final centuries of the Bronze Age with the Greek-speaking societies that came later. Their own palaces would eventually fall. Their writing would also be forgotten for many centuries. A long period of disruption would follow, separating the world of the Bronze Age from classical Greece. Yet stories survived when buildings did not. They were repeated from one generation to another. Singers carried them through the darker centuries. Names, places, and fragments of ancient events were reshaped into poetry and myth. By the time Greek writers began recording these traditions, the Minoan world had become something distant and mysterious. It was no longer remembered clearly as an archaeological civilization. Instead, it had become a golden and frightening age beyond ordinary history. Crete was the island of an ancient sea king. Knossos was the home of the labyrinth. Its hidden chambers contained a monster. Its craftsmen possessed impossible knowledge. Its princess helped an Athenian hero escape. The true Minoans had disappeared, but their shadow remained within the Greek imagination. And through that shadow, they became part of the origin story of Europe itself. The later Greeks looked backward toward Crete with both admiration and unease. They remembered its wealth. They remembered its power over the sea. They remembered the bull, the palace, and the mysterious ruler named Minos. What remained was not accurate history. It was something softer and less certain, a dreamlike memory, a collection of images preserved after names and dates had faded. Yet, within those myths, pieces of the real Minoan world continued to survive. The open palaces became a maze. The skilled artisans became one legendary inventor. The maritime empire became the kingdom of Minos. The sacred bull became the Minotaur. And so the civilization of Crete was not entirely lost. It lived quietly inside the stories of the people who came after it, waiting for archaeology to uncover the world that had first inspired them. The Minoans provided the rich artistic and cultural ground from which some of the earliest roots of Western civilization began to grow. Their influence passed quietly into the societies that followed them. Mycenaean rulers borrowed their systems of administration. Mainland artists learned from their fresco painters. Craftsmen adopted their techniques in pottery, metalwork, jewelry, and stone carving. Their sacred symbols entered new religious traditions, while distant memories of their palaces, ships, bulls, and rulers survived inside Greek mythology. In this way, the spirit of Minoan civilization continued long after the island had lost its independence. Yet the physical world that had created this culture was approaching its final end. After the Mycenaean takeover, the palace of Knossos continued to function for roughly another 75 years. Its rulers now spoke an early form of Greek. Its scribes wrote their records in linear B. Administrators still counted livestock, grain, wine, oil, weapons, workers, and religious offerings. Goods continued to pass through the storerooms. Ceremonies may still have taken place in the central court. The old corridors remained active, though the voices moving through them had changed. The palace was no longer the center of an independent Minoan maritime world. It had become a Mycenaean-controlled seat of power. Still, many parts of its older traditions remained. The same sacred rooms may have continued to receive offerings. The same workshops may have employed generations of skilled Cretan artisans. The same staircases, courts, and painted chambers were used by new rulers who had inherited the magnificent structure from the people they had conquered. Then, sometime around the year 1375 before the Common Era, the final destruction came. A catastrophic fire swept through the palace. This was not a small blaze confined to one storeroom or residential chamber. The fire spread across the entire 6-acre complex. It moved through wooden doors, roof beams, upper floors, furniture, storage rooms, and painted halls. Smoke filled the corridors. Flames rose through light wells and staircases. The heat became intense enough to damage stone, crack plaster, and harden soft clay. The great staircase collapsed. The magnificent frescoes were scorched, shattered, and buried beneath falling debris. Painted figures that had survived for centuries disappeared behind smoke and dust. The great wooden columns, painted in their distinctive red color and narrowing toward their bases, were consumed by the flames. Roofs fell inward. Upper stories collapsed into the chambers below. Storage jars broke open, spilling their contents across floors that were already covered in ash. The palace that had once been filled with sunlight, movement, music, ceremony, and color became a dark field of ruin. For more than 500 years, Knossos had been rebuilt after earthquakes, fires, and periods of destruction. Each time, new walls had risen over the old foundations. Rooms had been repaired. Frescoes had been repainted. The palace had grown larger and more complex with every generation. But after this final fire, it was never rebuilt. The long history of the palace had ended. The precise cause of the destruction remains unknown. A natural disaster is possible, but it does not fully explain the evidence. Other important sites on Crete do not appear to have suffered the same widespread destruction at exactly the same time. For this reason, many archaeologists believe the fire may have been connected with human conflict. Perhaps the native population of Crete rebelled against its Mycenaean rulers. After decades of foreign control, local communities may have risen against the palace authorities. Knossos could have become the main target because it represented the center of Mycenaean administration on the island. A desperate uprising may have entered the palace and deliberately set it on fire. It is an intriguing possibility. Yet no surviving written account tells us that such a rebellion occurred. Another possibility is that the attackers were Mycenaeans themselves. The mainland was divided among several powerful palace kingdoms. Rulers at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, and other centers competed for wealth, territory, prestige, and access to trade. Knossos controlled valuable routes through the southern Aegean and remained an important administrative center. A rival ruler from the mainland may have seen it as a dangerous competitor. An attack on Knossos could have removed an opposing king and transferred control of Cretan trade to another palace. The fire may therefore have been the result of a conflict within the Mycenaean world, rather than a struggle between Minoans and foreign conquerors. There may also have been internal palace conflict. A dispute over succession, authority, or resources could have turned violent. The final destruction might have resulted from several pressures occurring together. Political rivalry, economic weakness, social unrest, and the growing instability of the late Bronze Age. The truth remains hidden. No inscription identifies the attackers. No surviving poem describes the fall of the palace. The stones preserve the evidence of fire, but not the names or motives of the people who caused it. Whatever happened, the result was final. The age of the great palaces on Crete was over. People continued to live on the island. Some settled among or near the ruins. Small communities occupied parts of the old palace site for a time. Families built simpler homes where grand administrative chambers had once stood. They may have used fallen stones from the palace walls as building material. Animals grazed near abandoned courts. Rain entered rooms that had once been protected by several floors. Plants slowly grew through cracks in the pavements. But the centralized authority that had organized Minoan society disappeared. There were no longer enormous palace storerooms collecting the produce of the countryside. There was no great administrative system directing thousands of workers. The international trading network had weakened. The wealth that supported painters, jewelers, sculptors, scribes, priests, sailors, and specialized craftsmen was gone. The island remained inhabited, but the sophisticated palace civilization that had defined Crete for centuries had vanished. In one of history's quiet ironies, the fire that destroyed Knossos also preserved its final written records. The linear B tablets had been made from soft, sun-dried clay. Under ordinary conditions, they would have broken apart or dissolved over time. But as the flames passed through the archive rooms, the heat baked the tablets until they became hard. The palace burned around them. Walls collapsed. Roofs fell. The scribes who had written the records disappeared. Yet the tablets survived beneath the debris. They remained there for more than 3,000 years, preserving inventories, names, offerings, livestock counts, and the ordinary administrative concerns of the palace's final rulers. The records survived not because anyone intended to protect them. They survived because the destruction was so intense. After the fall of Knossos, Crete gradually lost its central place in the eastern Mediterranean world. The island that had once commanded trade routes and influenced distant courts became far less powerful. Other civilizations rose, empires expanded and disappeared. New cities were built, languages changed. The old palace faded from memory. The walls disappeared beneath soil and vegetation. Olive trees grew above buried rooms. The name of the people who had built the palace was forgotten. Only the myths remained. Then, thousands of years later, Arthur Evans returned to the hill of Kephala. To visit Knossos today is to enter not only the ancient palace, but also the vision of the archaeologist who uncovered it. Many archaeological sites survive as low lines of stone. A visitor walks between foundations and must imagine the walls, ceilings, staircases, and upper stories that once stood there. Knossos is different. Arthur Evans believed that simply exposing the ruins was not enough. The surviving walls were fragile. Rain, wind, sunlight, and temperature changes began to damage the ancient plaster as soon as it was uncovered. Wooden structures had disappeared long ago, leaving many parts of the palace difficult to understand. Evans therefore made a controversial decision. He began to reconstruct parts of the site. Using modern reinforced concrete, he rebuilt sections of walls, staircases, columns, and upper floors. The distinctive red columns were raised once again. Their shape was unusual, wider at the top and narrower at the bottom. Portions of the great staircase were restored. Balconies and covered passages were recreated. Copies of the frescoes were placed on the walls to suggest how the palace might once have appeared. Evans wanted visitors to experience the structure as a living architectural space. He did not want Knossos to remain only a collection of foundations. He wanted people to understand its height, color, complexity, and movement. His reconstructions made that possible. Visitors could stand beneath columns. They could look down staircases. They could imagine frescoes covering the walls and sunlight entering through open courts. The palace became easier to visualize, yet the work also created serious questions. Modern archaeologists often criticize parts of Evans's reconstruction. Some sections were based on limited evidence. Certain walls, colors, and room functions may have been interpreted too confidently. The reinforced concrete does not belong to the Bronze Age, and can sometimes make it difficult to distinguish the ancient remains from modern additions. Evans was influenced by his own ideas about Minoan society. He gave rooms names such as the throne room, the Queen's Megaron, and the royal apartments, even when their original functions were not fully certain. His reconstruction of Knossos is therefore not a perfect restoration of the ancient palace. It is partly archaeology and partly interpretation. It reflects the evidence found in the ground, but also the imagination of the man who uncovered it. Still, the reconstructed site offers something powerful. It allows visitors to feel the enormous scale of the building. The palace no longer appears as a flat plan on a page. It rises around them. The staircases descend into lower levels. Columns frame views across the courts. Corridors turn unexpectedly. Rooms open into light wells and balconies. For a moment, it becomes easier to understand how the palace may have inspired the story of the labyrinth. A visitor can walk through a place that feels both real and dreamlike. The ancient stones and modern reconstructions blend together. Bright sunlight falls across red columns. Shadows gather in the lower rooms. The distant mountains remain visible beyond the site. The sounds of modern visitors move through spaces that were silent for thousands of years. Yet, to understand the Minoan world fully, the palace alone is not enough. Knossos reveals the scale of their architecture. It shows how the courts, staircases, storerooms, ceremonial chambers, and residential spaces were arranged. But the most delicate treasures found within the palace are no longer kept there. The original frescoes, figurines, pottery, jewelry, seal stones, tablets, and ritual objects require protection from sunlight, rain, and changing temperatures. They are housed nearby in the Heraclean Archaeological Museum. The museum contains the finest collection of Minoan art and artifacts in the world. There, the objects discovered across Crete are gathered together in carefully controlled rooms. A visitor can stand before the original fresco fragments from Knossos. The cupbearer still carries his ceremonial vessel. The young woman, called La Parisienne, still looks outward with her dark eye and faint red smile. The bull continues to charge across the bull-leaping fresco, while the athletes remain suspended in a moment of impossible movement. The dolphins still swim through their blue-painted sea. Nearby are the snake goddess figurines. They are much smaller than their fame might suggest. Their bodies are carefully shaped from faience. Their layered skirts spread beneath them. Their arms remain raised. The snakes twist in their hands. Their eyes look forward with the same intense expression that has fascinated viewers since their discovery. Behind glass, they appear quiet and still, yet they carry the weight of an entire lost religious world. The museum also contains Kamares ware with its delicate walls and swirling decoration. Marine-style pottery shows octopuses and sea creatures moving around the shapes of vessels. Gold jewelry reveals the precision of Minoan metalworkers. Seal stones contain tiny scenes that become visible only under magnification. Clay tablets preserve scripts that remain partly or completely unreadable. Ceremonial vessels shaped like bulls' heads recall the sacred importance of the animal. Each object adds another piece to the story. At Knossos, one experiences the scale of Minoan civilization. In the museum, one encounters its detail. The palace shows the world they built. The artifacts reveal the hands, eyes, beliefs, and imagination of the people who lived within it. To understand the Minoans, we must see both. We need Arthur Evans's grand, reconstructed vision of the palace rising beneath the Cretan sun. But we also need the fragile objects preserved in quiet museum cases. One gives us architecture. The other gives us the delicate soul of the civilization. And so our journey ends where it began, with a mystery. More than a century of excavation has revealed an extraordinary amount about the Minoan world. We know how their palaces were arranged. We know what they stored in their magazines. We know how their ships may have looked and where their merchants traveled. We know that they painted dolphins, flowers, bulls, processions, and elegant human figures. We know that they climbed mountains to leave offerings and entered caves to approach the powers beneath the earth. We know that they created delicate pottery, tiny carved seals, brilliant jewelry, and complex drainage systems. We know that women occupied important positions in their religious art. We know that bulls and double axes carried sacred meaning. We know that their civilization was deeply connected to the sea. and yet their greatest secrets remain hidden. Linear A still cannot be fully read. The signs are visible, but their meaning remains uncertain. We do not know the true names of their rulers. We do not know what they called the snake goddess, or whether they even understood her as a goddess. We do not know the prayers spoken in caves or on mountain peaks. We do not know the words sung during processions. We do not know the full meaning of bull leaping. We do not know exactly how political authority was organized. We do not know whether one king ruled all of Crete or whether several palace centers shared power. We cannot fully explain the collapse of their civilization. The eruption of Thera weakened them. Trade declined. Mycenaean rulers took control. Knossos eventually burned. But many details remain uncertain. The Minoans are therefore both familiar and unreachable. We can see their faces in frescoes. We can walk through their palace corridors. We can hold copies of their pottery and examine photographs of their seals. Their world appears before us in remarkable color and detail. But when we ask them to speak, they remain silent. Perhaps this silence is a part of their lasting power. They remind us that history is never completely finished. The past is not a single story preserved perfectly and waiting to be repeated. It is made from fragments, a broken wall, a burned tablet, a painted piece of plaster, a small figurine hidden beneath a palace floor, a myth repeated long after its original meaning was forgotten. Archaeologists gather these fragments and attempt to connect them. Each discovery changes the shape of the story. A new tablet may reveal a forgotten name. A new excavation may challenge an older theory. A volcanic layer may alter the date of a destruction. A re-examined object may show that an interpretation accepted for decades was mistaken. History is therefore an act of continual rediscovery. It is a journey through a labyrinth of evidence, memory, imagination, and myth. Some corridors lead toward answers. Others end suddenly. Some open into unexpected rooms, and somewhere deeper within the maze, more secrets may still be waiting. Perhaps one day a bilingual inscription will be found, and Linear A will finally be understood. Perhaps the Minoans will speak again through their own words. Until then, we continue to approach them through the beauty they left behind. Their dolphins still leap through painted water. Their ships still glide across the frescoes of Thera. Their goddesses still raise their arms. Their bulls still charge across palace walls. Their small seal stones still preserve entire worlds within surfaces no larger than a fingertip. Their civilization disappeared, but its presence has never completely faded. It survived in Mycenaean art. It survived in Greek religion. It survived in the stories of Minos, Ariadne, Theseus, Daedalus, and the Minotaur. It survived beneath the olive groves of Crete, waiting for the sound of an archaeologist's spade. And now, as our journey comes to an end, we can leave the palace quietly. Imagine the last light of evening falling across Knossos. The crowds have gone. The red columns cast long shadows over the stones. A warm breeze moves through the open courts. Beyond the palace, the hills of Crete grow dark beneath the slowly rising moon. The corridors become still once again. The painted dolphins rest beneath the museum lights. The snake goddess watches silently from behind the glass. Far to the north, the curved cliffs of Santorini rise above the sea, preserving the shape of an ancient volcano. The Aegean water moves gently between the islands, following the same routes once traveled by Minoan ships. I am the Midnight Cat, and our path through this ancient labyrinth has now returned us to the quiet night. Thank you for joining me on this long journey into the Bronze Age. I hope the lost world of the Minoans brought a little beauty, peace, and mystery into your evening. Let the palace fade softly into the distance. Let the sea grow calm. And wherever you are listening tonight, I wish you a deep, gentle, and peaceful sleep.